This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion.
Okay, I admit I'm being a little lazy today. Well, not really lazy, but I've got to travel. I've got to take off on a little bit of a quick journey. So I decided a great mega episode. I sat down and I said, who are 4 really, really interesting guests to bring on? First up out of the gate, William Poundstone, author, especially known for his book, Fortune's Formula, the untold story of the scientific betting system that beat the casinos and Wall Street. If you've not yet read that book, you must have a problem. Up next, one of my favorites who I have known for a long time, Michael Mauboussin, Wall Street analyst and author. 2 of his books, which are also must-reads. The Success Equation, Untangling Skill and Luck in Business, Sports, and Investing, must read. And also, More Than You Know, Finding Financial Wisdom in Unconventional Places. I have loved reading Michael's stuff for 20 years, I think. Something like that. I need to have him on again for a fresh, new, live perspective. But for now, let me reach back into my archives because Michael's work is often timeless. Up next, a little bit of a sad note because I really enjoyed this conversation. Charles Poliquin, strength coach. He passed away in the fall of 2018, but his wisdom lives on. If you want to know something about strength training, go check out Charles' work. And finally, bringing up the end of this particular mega episode, a cognitive psychologist, linguist, known for his advocacy of evolutionary psychology and the computational theory of mind. Very well-known gentleman, Steven Pinker. Now, where the hell do you get that kind of diversity on one episode? Have a seat, jump in, listen. And as you listen to all 4 of these men, what are the commonalities? Because I really think there are some. Enjoy. You know, I have to say, and I reread Fortune's Formula in the last 24, 48 hours. The thread that you had to weave for that book, that must have been terribly fun. I mean, how did you get this gig?
I went to MIT, and there I heard all these almost urban legends about Claude Shannon. So I started investigating that and the whole idea that he had used information theory in the stock market. And it just kept building kind of like a snowball, I guess. You found these different threads of it, and, you brought in all these incredible people into it.
No, it's fascinating. And I wanted to lead off with a quote, which I thought would be a good starting point to get people to understand why. And your book came out in 2006, but I would argue, it's not a sales pitch, but I would argue that anybody that's interested in investing, sure, they can go figure out the information in your book, perhaps somewhere else. It might take them a lifetime to do. So I would just recommend taking the shortcut and going straight to Fortune's Formula. But there's a great quote from Bernoulli, I think 1700s. A man who risks his entire fortune acts like a simpleton. And I think that really gets at the heart of where Fortune's Formula goes, doesn't it?
Yes, I mean that's a good common sense encapsulation of the Kelly criterion.
Well, let me jump into some big picture issues. I mean, clearly it's a dense work. There's a lot of detail, so we can only cover so much in a short period of time. But I thought there's some interesting connections in it to give the audience up to speed. I sent you some pictures that were my
Like as I said, my grandfather's uncle, who was a prosecutor in Chicago, and some pictures with him with Al Capone. And I think it's interesting, and I'd love for you to tell a little bit of the story about the close correlation, the intertwined aspect of bookmaking and the telephone industry in the early part of the 20th century, because they were intertwined, weren't they? And Al Capone was actually in there a little bit.
Yes, and I mean, that was really part of the big inspiration for the Kelly formula. So, I mean, it is very central to the story.
Why don't you go ahead and explain a little bit about how bookmaking and the telephone industry was intertwined? And we'll quickly get out of that and get back into Bell Labs and what ultimately came to be the Kelly criteria.
Yeah, well, in the early part of the 20th century, there was what were called wire services, which basically was how the illegal bookmakers learned which horses had run at the various racetracks. Now, nowadays with ESPN and everything, we don't think that's an issue, but it really was at the time. It was very important for these bookies to get the race results as fast as possible. So to do that, they had these wire services, which were generally run by organized crime figures. And what they did, they leased, phone lines from AT&T in order to transmit these race results. And this ended up being a very big part of AT&T's business. At one point, Mo Annenberg, who ran the largest wire service, was one of AT&T's very biggest customers, and he had all these mob connections. So it was very, closely related there. It was something obviously AT&T didn't like to talk about too much. But basically, these wire services were the origin of the whole idea behind the Kelly formula or Kelly criterion. At that time, John Kelly was a computer scientist at Bell Labs in New Jersey, which, of course, was this legendary, tech think tank that was run by AT&T. And they were allowed to do pretty much anything they wanted as long as it had some loose connection with the phone business or communications. And Kelly was aware of these wire services. He was also aware of a unique cheating scam on the game shows of the time, like the $64,000 question. At the time, that show was incredibly popular. It was produced in New York. It aired live on the East Coast, but it was delayed 3 hours on the West Coast. And there was a news story saying that one, West Coast gambler simply learned the winners by phone from the East Coast, and then he had like 2.5 hours to place bets with some of the most gullible people in California who didn't realize that the show had already aired and the winner was already known. And apparently, for a time, he made a certain amount of profit from this. So, Kelly was thinking about that, and it got him thinking of this whole abstract question. Suppose you've got, some inside tips on a horse race or, for that matter, the stock market. How can you use that to make the most money possible from that information? And what he intuited, I guess, was that there was a deep connection between that and information theory. Now, information theory was devised by his friend, Claude Shannon, who also worked at Bell Labs. And it's really the mathematical theory of communication. It's essentially the basis of our whole digital world today. Shannon was basically the guy who decided that computers should think with ones and zeros rather than digital numbers. And his information theory was really the basis of the Internet, all digital media today. So even though this was back in the 1940s when it came up with this, he's really, the grandfather of our world as we know it today. So a very brilliant man. And of course, Kelly was very intrigued by this information theory, as was everyone else at Bell Labs. But as he got thinking about it, he realized that the answer to his question about the optimal betting on fixed horse races was actually identical to a formula that was in Claude Shannon's information theory. He basically found this, if you've got these inside tips, you've got the question of how much to bet on each tip. Now, it might seem this would be a no-brainer, that if the 6th race at Belmont is fixed and Seabiscuit is going to win, you would simply bet everything you've got on Seabiscuit. But Kelly was smart enough to know that would not be a good idea because, there's always some chance that the tip is going to be wrong. And if you had this blanket policy of staking your whole bankroll on every, tip you get, your wealth would grow exponentially up until the point when you get your first bum tip, and then you'd lose everything. You'd be out of the game. Now, the opposite approach might be to just be very conservative and maybe place a minimum wager based on each tip. But if you did that, you obviously would kind of be squandering the real value of these inside tips you're getting. So Kelly did the math and showed that the optimal way of betting was kind of a middle course. You would scale your bets both to your bankroll and to how accurate those tips are. And he gave a formula saying exactly how you should do that. And he showed that this would do two things. First of all, it would give you the maximum compound rate of return on your investment. And secondly, it would guarantee that you would never go broke. But what he realized was that one of the formulas he came up with was actually, as I say, identical to something in information theory. Basically, he showed that the maximum growth rates you can expect depends on the bits of information you're getting in these tips as measured in, bits according to Shannon's notion of information. So this was really an incredible situation of drawing a connection between two things that were completely different. And it wasn't just a facile analogy. I mean, it was really a very profound connection. So Kelly showed this to Shannon, and Shannon was really intrigued by gambling and games, anything like that. So he encouraged Kelly to publish it. And he did that, but actually he got into a little trouble with AT&T over this, because this was the 1950s. And at the time, there had been these Senate hearings on organized crime and gambling, and they had publicized the fact that AT&T derived a lot of its money from these wire services that were, aiding and abetting illegal gamblers. So Kelly's paper was called Information Theory and Gambling, and AT&T executives thought, maybe that's not such a good idea. It'll suggest that maybe we're actually sponsoring research to benefit these bookies and gangsters. So they basically told him they'd have to give it a different name. And the title he finally came up with was A New Interpretation of Information Rate, which is just completely obscure and completely unsexy. And this publication was published in the Bell System Technical Journal. Now, as that suggests, it was really intended for phone company engineers back at a time when the phone company was landlines and rotary dials and human operators. So really, no one in economics or finance read that article. And for that reason, and partly because of this history of AT&T and the gamblers, that's one reason why the Kelly formula really took a long time to really become well known.
Well, as you mentioned the word tip, let me give it a little bit different terminology. And ultimately, I know this is what you meant, but ultimately you mean an edge, a mathematical edge, whether you're talking trading or casinos and casino games, we're talking about a mathematical edge. And having that edge, and if you don't have no edge, no bet. And then that statement right there alone will cause a lot of people to go, hold on, what do you mean no edge, no bet? No edge, no bet.
Yes, exactly. He did actually talk of these rather, amusingly criminal examples like fixed horse races, fixed ball games, but what he meant was any sort of mathematical advantage. So classic example, if you're a card counter at blackjack and you do actually have a mathematical edge, you could use the Kelly formula. If you've got some great trading algorithm in the stock market and it does give you an advantage, you can use it there. But again, the most important thing, as you say, is that the Kelly formula says you bet only in situations where you do have a mathematical edge. So, if you're asking what's the Kelly approach to slot machines, obviously it's to keep the money in your pocket.
You mentioned something earlier here about the idea of you think you've got a sure thing, but there's a small percentage chance you could lose. And the idea of accepting a small risk of losing everything, you will eventually lose everything.
Yes, exactly. And that's really the thing that sets the Kelly criterion apart from almost any other money management system, and the thing that I think makes it so relevant. even since I've written the book. I mean, we've learned a lot in behavioral economics about people just systematically tend to be overconfident. I mean, if I'm a brilliant trader and I have what I think is this really unbeatable algorithm, it's just natural to, first of all, overestimate your edge, perhaps, and certainly to underestimate the error bars in all your estimates. So it's actually very useful to have a Kelly-type philosophy because it is a little more forgiving of errors in that it really tells you to shy away from any slightest possibility of something that would cause you to completely go broke. So in a sense, although this was basically motivated by simply the mathematics of what's the best way of optimizing your return from any sort of edge, it really is, from a psychological standpoint, a very good policy as well.
I think to people that are new to this style of thinking, you might say the highest compounded return without going broke. And I think most people would go, yeah, I want that. That sounds good to me. That sounds good. You know, I want the best return I can get without going broke. However, as you mentioned, your fine school, MIT, there was some controversy here. And Paul Samuelson, very accomplished professor at MIT, he really never came around to this. Was it a direct? They were peers, Claude Shannon and Samuelson, and I guess Kelly would have been in the loop too. Were they all actively debating this in person, or was it only in papers and whatnot?
Well, Kelly died rather tragically young at age 41 in, I think it was the early 1960s. So he was really not part of this debate. But certainly Claude Shannon and Paul Samuelson were. And in the book, I go into Samuelson and other economist reactions to this, which might sound like it would be a really slow, boring part of the book. But actually, it's a lot of fun, and that's largely because of Paul Samuelson, who was just this wonderfully witty person who would, be attacking the Kelly formula, but with a good deal of wit. As to what his objection was, it was really twofold. For one thing, the whole efficient market theory was in ascendance at that time. And, it was, if you believe that there is no such thing as an edge in the market because the market is all efficient all the time, then the Kelly formula would be simply irrelevant, as it's irrelevant to slot machines where there's no edge. So that was one objection. But Samuelson had a subtler one that I think does have a certain amount of truth to it, and it's important to understand. He was basically saying that, again, from a behavioral economics point of view, most people just are not comfortable with the level of aggressive risk-taking that you have with Kelly betting or investing. Because you can show mathematically that, if you make a series of Kelly bets or investments on single opportunities, your bankroll is going to be highly volatile. In fact, you can make a chart of it, as I do in the book, and it's even more volatile than, say, the S&P 500 index. And a lot of people are not terribly comfortable with that. You can, in fact, show mathematically that at any given point in time, a Kelly bettor stands a 50% chance of losing 50% of his current bankroll at some point in the future. Now, of course, you will continue to go up after that. The loss is, you might say, temporary. But the Kelly bettor spends a lot of time being less wealthy than he was in the recent past. And at an emotional level, this is something that people find it difficult to deal with. So Samuelson was saying, okay, this is fine as a mathematical footnote, but when you look at real people, how they really invest, how they want to really invest, this is just too aggressive, and it's not really worth the heartache. And in some degrees, even Ed Thorpe, who was, of course, for one thing, the inventor of card counting, a friend of Shannon's, and a very successful hedge fund manager, he sort of came to agree that, particularly in blackjack, most people just are not cut out for full Kelly betting in terms of the emotional up and down. But you really don't have to do full Kelly betting. You can use like 3/4 Kelly, half Kelly. And it turns out that most of the advantage you get with Kelly betting is actually available at say, half Kelly betting. In that case, you would get 75% of the maximum compound growth rate, but with much less volatility. And a lot of card counters now believe that half Kelly betting is probably a better compromise there. So in that sense, I think Samuelson did have a point about the behavioral economics of this.
I have two follow-up points on Samuelson. So as we mentioned, efficient market hypothesis, Samuelson, Fama. And so that foundation really, at least from my perspective, was the foundation for the mutual fund industry to say, you can't beat it, just join us, and we're either going to have a mutual fund that closely mirrors the index or frankly, just the index. And what's interesting is if we look at what's happened from a performance perspective, we have seen in 72, 74, we've seen in 87, 2000 to 2002, 2008, 2009, I guess not in 87, but those other three instances, 50% plus downdrafts in equity indices. So what I find is interesting is, yes, pure Kelly, very aggressive. As you point out, perhaps bring it down a notch or two, half Kelly. But the efficient market world that Samuelson and others were promoting was not without risk either.
Yes, exactly. And Samuelson it was his writings that were a big inspiration for the whole index market industry. He was suggesting something like that in a lot of his things. Yeah, I suppose, what he would say is that probably the average person should not even be invested in 100% in an index fund as well, because, again, these 50% drawdowns are very difficult for most people to take.
Yeah. One other point on Samuelson that I find interesting, and I don't think you brought it up in the book. I tried to search for it. I don't remember reading it, but he was one of the founders of Commodities Corporation. You were familiar with Commodities Corporation, I'm guessing.
Not that well. I've just heard of it.
Yeah. Commodities Corporation was basically a fund of funds, and they staked traders. And so under their umbrella, it's an operation that was eventually sold to Goldman Sachs. It still exists under Goldman Sachs now. But what's really interesting about Commodities Corporation is that many of the traders that traded there and became famous, that were in Jack Schwager's Market Wizards book, were technical traders, all believing they had an edge, all using Kelly-style betting strategies, all under the umbrella of the firm that Paul Samuelson started.
Oh, that's quite interesting. I wasn't aware of that. I do know, though, that, and I do mention that, Samuelson always was kind of the person to hedge his bets.
That's a pretty big hedge.
Yes, he was very skeptical of the idea that anyone can beat the market, but he invested in Berkshire Hathaway and obviously did quite well from that. So, it fits in with what I have heard.
A few names, for example, that came out of Commodities Corporation. I'll send you some stuff on it. You probably find it interesting. But Bruce Kovner, Ed Secota, Paul Tudor Jones, Louis Bacon, all traders that went for that, finding the edge and then having a Kelly-style betting, whether it was half or not. But the idea that it was right there. So it was really interesting. I thought that was. I tell you what, there's one other area I wanted to go in this discussion is long-term capital management, because I think that was a great example. And there's some other great books about that too. You go into it nicely. But long-term capital management, hedge fund that went belly up in summer of 98? I think so.
Yes, 98.
Yeah. And so the head of long-term capital management, and I'm going to shorten this a little bit, John Merriweather, formerly of Solomon Brothers, he was a martingale bettor. Why don't you go ahead and define for the audience martingale versus Kelly? Because I think it'll be a good contrast.
Well, in the extreme form, a martingale simply means you when you lose, you double your bet and keep doubling until you win. So hopefully you end up with a relatively small profit. The problem with martingale betting in the market or in the casino, for that matter, and it did actually start in the casinos, is that while it's a system that theoretically will work, in actual fact you have these massive drawdowns of your capital, and pretty soon you're going to end up with no cash, and you can't raise any cash to continue going on. And in short, that's basically what happened with long-term capital. They had, of course, many different bets that they believed to be uncorrelated. And they were uncorrelated in an ordinary market, but then when you have a sudden crisis in Russia, suddenly all those bets end up being correlated at just the wrong time. Now, the real problem was that they were using very high leverage, by some accounts like as much as 30 times. Thorpe did a big analysis of this, which I think is quite interesting. He says that they were basically betting on situations where they might have like a 0.67% expected gain on a typical trade. And it was only the leverage that made this, something better, or something that they could really sell to investors. But it was, kind of ridiculous at that time. I mean, even Treasury bonds were selling at 5.5%. But it was basically a case of where they had these two Nobel Prize winners on staff. They could Meriwether was this wonderful salesman who could really make this sound like this was the new scientific thing, but basically it was based on an extreme amount of leverage. Now, if you look at what the Kelly criterion says of that, basically the Kelly criterion, as one person in the book I quote says, it is a threshold. It's the boundary between aggressive betting and insane betting. And by insane, I mean that if you bet if your wager sizes are any bigger than the Kelly bet, you are basically reducing your long-term expected capital growth rate, while of course accepting much greater volatility. So there's really no excuse for doing that. If you're very aggressive, you might want to make a full Kelly bet, but it's probably better to be maybe 3/4 or half Kelly. That does give you a little more breathing room in case some of your estimates were off. But long-term capital was kind of a perfect storm. I mean, they were sure they knew exactly what the correlations were. They knew exactly what the error bars were, and apparently they didn't. And since they were over-betting, they were really in big trouble when they had this financial crisis. According to Thorpe's analysis, I mean, it seems quite possible that in terms of Kelly betting, they were betting about twice the Kelly bet. And if you look at the Kelly equation, that basically says that your long-term capital growth rate is predicted to be 0. You can, of course, make a lot of profit before the first big catastrophe, but in the long run, you're basically making nothing at all. And that seems to have been confirmed by the actual history evidence.
The law of large numbers can be good for you if you've not really produced any return and you're practicing Kelly correctly. But the law of large numbers, if you're over betting, will eventually catch up to you as well.
Yes. I mean, there's so many things in life that, gambles we take that really are ruinous if you do it in the long run. And you have to make this judgment call. I mean, maybe you don't want to take up a very dangerous sport because you figure eventually you're going to be in some horrible accident. But when, there's also a risk involved in driving a car, in taking an airplane. And I suppose if you were really planning on living forever, you probably shouldn't ever go in an airplane or drive a car. But of course we do that. But the Kelly criterion, basically takes that long-term approach and says, if you want to be in business indefinitely, this is what you've got to do. You've got to avoid these risks of losing all your bankroll. And as I say, the real irony is that this hedge fund called itself long-term capital management. But the long-term wasn't very long for them.
Hey, Bill, why don't you go ahead and just take a few minutes. He's really one of the stars of the book, which is Ed Thorpe, who really ties together so many of these. And I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, there's a thread here that's terribly fascinating that there's just no way we can fill up in 30, 40 minutes. So, but why don't you go ahead and take a few minutes to describe Ed Thorpe? And he used Kelly not only on casino games, but as an investor. And his investing track record, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it was right there Warren Buffett-esque, wasn't it? For 20 plus years?
Yes, very, very definitely. So he's really the person who ties everything together in the book. Ed Thorpe was a mathematician. He came to MIT. And while he was there, he read an article about some people who had done mathematicians, I believe at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, actually, who had used early computers to try and devise an optimal strategy for blackjack. And he thought that was interesting, but Thorpe realized that he could probably come up with a better way of doing it. So he did come up with this strategy now called card counting. Because in blackjack, if you keep track of the cards as they're played, at that time they were dealt from a single deck, you would know something. You would know, how many aces are left in the deck, and how many high cards, how many low cards, and if you could use that to adjust your strategy in terms of how you play and how much you bet on each hand. And he was able to show that you could get a real advantage of this, generally a percentage point or two, but, it's amazing to have an advantage in any sort of casino game. So after he came up with this, he wanted to get it published, and he figured the person he should go to was Claude Shannon. So he got an appointment with Shannon, and, his secretary was very forbidding, said, Mr. Shannon really does not like to talk to people that long. He's very busy, so make sure you get right to the point. Well, he went in there, he talked about this blackjack system, and Shannon thought it was wonderful. It was the most amazing thing he'd heard, because Shannon was really intrigued by, as I say, anything to do with games or even toys or, machines and so forth. So he thought this was great, and he helped him get this paper published. Now, when it was published, it got tons of publicity, as you might expect, and he got all sorts of offers from gamblers who were offering to stake him in Las Vegas. Because, Thorpe had not really used this. He had just done the math and published this paper. So finally he got a visit from one of these people, who was a man by the name of Emanuel Kimmel. And he showed up in a Cadillac between two gorgeous blonde women in mink coats. And he was this, short guy in his 60s. So he got out of the car, he talked to Thorpe and seemed to be quite impressed with him. So he said, okay, he's going to give Thorpe $10,000 to play in Las Vegas or Reno. They ended up going to Reno, actually, because Kimmel said that he was too well known in Las Vegas. So obviously he did have some sort of connections there. So they went to Reno, in a little over 27 hours or something like that, Thorpe had more than doubled his money with this system. As I say, the only catch was that the agreement was that Kimmel got to keep 90% of any profit he made. And Thorpe had agreed to that because, first of all, he wasn't sure there would be a profit since he'd never actually used this in a casino. And secondly, he thought this would just be a fun experience. He was planning on maybe doing a book about it. And, of course, he did write a book, which is, of course, is Beat the Dealer, which remains the Bible of card counting. So for several years, he was a mathematician, but he would keep going to Las Vegas to play cards, and he regarded it as his personal ATM machine because he could make money so easily. But after the book came out, it got a lot harder because the casinos started passing his picture around. They would bar him. His counter move was this, he had a friend who did makeup for Hollywood, so he would wear these disguises. But even then, the casino people got pretty good at spotting him. And 2 times they actually put Mickeys in his drink while he was gambling. So after a while, he decided that, it's probably easier to make money somewhere else. And he decided, why not the stock market? Because this was something that was actually mentioned as a possible application in John Kelly's original paper. So he started looking into that. He ended up starting with warrants, which at the time were really the only kind of options that the average retail investor could work with. And he figured, if he could find a way of predicting which warrants were underpriced and then buy those warrants, he would be in good shape. He could use the Kelly formula. But there didn't seem to be any way of doing that, so he sat down and came up with his own mathematical way of valuing warrants. And this was essentially what we now call the Black-Scholes formula. But, of course, this was before Black and Scholes had published it. And so by applying this formula, basically, Thorpe found that most warrants were really overpriced. They were almost like carnival games, costing way too much based on what you could win and your chance of winning it. But he did find a few underpriced warrants, so he began trading them, and he really did pretty well. And it kind of snowballed from there. Friends began giving him money to invest. He kept, compounding what he made. And eventually he started a hedge fund called Princeton Newport Partners. And this has become, quite legendary both for the consistency of its returns and its very high returns, which I think were around 22% over a 28-year period. So it was really pretty incredible. And he used all sorts of different trades, but he always had the Kelly formula to decide how much it would be okay to risk on any particular one. But there is kind of an interesting end to that story. As it turned out, their main broker was Michael Milken. And this was the time when Rudy Giuliani was an ambitious, federal attorney who was trying to investigate insider trading and various things like that. So they ended up raiding the offices of Princeton Newport Partners to try and get evidence against Milken. And, it's very hard to run a hedge fund when you've got that kind of publicity, so they shut down the hedge fund. And a few years later, Thorpe started his own because he was not involved in any of the illegal stuff. He was actually on the other coast. He operated out of California, where his computers generated the trades, and it was his partner in Princeton who, was actually schmoozing with Milken and the Wall Street people. But it was, kind of an amazing American success story of this guy who came from a very humble background, was really a mathematician, but he realized that there are so many ways of applying this and really became a big success as a money manager.
The entire, as I mentioned again, the entire thread of this, I guess I can see how you said it just kept building and building, and it must have just been, even like in our conversation today, and I'm suspecting that you will probably get off the phone with me and double check my insights about Commodities Corporation because it does tie right in. It's pretty amazing. And I wish Paul Samuelson was here to ask him further questions about it. But,
yes.
Listen, I tell you one last thing is interesting for me that happened to me in the last couple of years. I had a chance to interview Mike Aponte, and Mike was the team leader for the MIT blackjack team that became famous in the book and the film. So they too were inspired by Thorpe all those decades later, and were still able to look back and rely on Kelly to make millions of dollars.
Yes, exactly. I think Thorpe actually told me that he did get a letter from them, and there was a little bit of correspondence there. But that actually goes back a while. In fact, even before the blackjack, Thorpe and Shannon collaborated on this wearable computer that would predict roulette. It was actually able to predict which quadrant of the roulette wheel the ball was liable to land in. Because, it's basically just physics. So if you get the right information, tap it into the computer, they really could predict and get an advantage there. And they went to Las Vegas and managed to make a little money from this. But they figured that the blackjack gave them a better edge.
It is fascinating stuff. I highly recommend my audience to read Fortune's Formula. And like I said, if you think you could figure out all the details in this book, as an author of 5 books myself, I can tell you can't, unless you want to spend 10 years of your life trying to go obtain all this information. So take the shortcut and go to Amazon. That's my plug, Bill.
Well, I appreciate it very much.
Hey, listen, thank you for joining me, and thanks for providing my audience a great education today.
Well, thank you. It's been fun.
Take care.
Let's jump right in with the second interview of this mega episode. Michael Mauboussin.
So here's what I was thinking this morning. I was thinking, when was the first time I spotted you? And so I know officially I reached out in 2003 as I was writing a first book, and I wanted permission to quote from your work. But I was thinking it must have been the PDFs that you're putting out in the, I want to say 96, 97, 98. And I was collecting them like trading cards, because you were the guy, and I know you might say, well, somebody else influenced you, but you were the guy that was making it okay to put together this multidisciplinary thinking. And I look at my podcast now after 3 years, and it reads like a list that I would have programmed from you. It's like all the guys that I think, probably guys that a lot of them, I'm sure. But I mean, how did that begin for you? Where did you start to say all these disparate, different things out there you're pulling together in one coherent vision? How did that begin for you?
Well, I think, first of all, that I think some people naturally think this way more than others, and it's not a good thing or a bad thing necessarily, but I probably am one of those people that more naturally thinks this way, so that's probably the first factor. But for me, the very distinct event was visiting the Santa Fe Institute. So Santa Fe Institute is a non-degree conferring institute that was founded precisely to go across disciplines. And my first visit there was in the mid 1990s, coinciding with the same time period. And their point was a lot of the most vexing problems in the world really lie at the intersection of disciplines. And while you need to understand the big ideas from each discipline, you really want to bring a full toolbox to all these kinds of problems. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing is I was reading in a wider and wider ring of things. I was one of those guys who would watch TV or read an article or read a book and start talking back to it like, no, wait a second, what about this? This is really important. As a consequence, I thought to myself, rather than me talking to my TV or my book or my article, perhaps I should start to write about this stuff. So that sort of encouraged me to be a little bit more systematic in trying to make these connections. So it's sort of one thing led to another is the best answer for that.
And the tricky thing is, it's not just the pieces, it's how the pieces connect to the whole.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, the idea is to say, when we go through life, are there things that are analogous that can be helpful in developing mental models, right? And so are there things from physics can help us understand business, or psychology help us understand trading, or whatever it is? And often, psychologists do their thing and traders do their thing and don't think about how these things might intersect with one another. So yeah, exactly. It's and then the challenge is it takes a little bit of time and effort to get outside of your little area, and often you might be reading things or thinking about things that are intellectual cul-de-sacs. They don't lead you anywhere. But what you're doing is building up a set of tools in your mind so that when you're faced with a problem, you typically have the right tool to pull out to try to address that problem.
As I've seen you say, it's the larger reference class, not just you. Can you objectively, all of us, can we objectively look at ourselves and the situation? It's not an easy proposition, is it?
I think that's one of the best things we know from psychology is we tend to think of ourselves as unique. There's some good reasons for that. But in many cases, when you're thinking about decision making, it really does behoove you to look at larger reference classes and basically ask the simple question: what happened when other people were in this situation before? So there are lots of things we go through life that were sort of first time for us, or unique or unusual, but lots of other people have been through it before. And so appealing to that larger population is actually very, very helpful. But it's not a natural way to think, which is really interesting. So you have to go out and really seek it and pursue it and be very thoughtful about incorporating that into your mindset.
I thought of a real topical example would be the Swiss franc. And I saw one particular hedge fund, I don't remember the name, but apparently they lost a significant amount of money, nearly $1 billion. The larger reference class, that people could not imagine that quick of a move. But then again, if you take a step back, these types of moves have happened throughout history. So to not have that possibility in your toolbox, boy, if you're an investor and your manager, your trader is not thinking that way, that's a real cause for alarm, isn't it?
I agree with that. I heard that one of the large brokerage firms said that the event was a 40 standard deviation event, right? 40 sigma, which basically says it would never happen. I mean, in effect, part of the reason they came up with that number is looking at about, I think it was 10 or 20 years of data, which is certainly not a rich enough data set. Right now, here are the sort of both sides of it, right? Because if you're trading, I mean, I'm telling you this, much more about this than I do, but if you're trading with a particular strategy that's serving you well, so you're making money generally, you're grinding out, it's all working well. The fact is, you probably feel like you've got a handle on things, right? And so you don't really want to introduce these possibilities of these extreme events. And as a consequence, people's they're looking at data sets that aren't long enough or not rich enough. They're almost incentivized not to pay attention to some of that stuff until these sort of really adverse events take place. So part of it's the human nature element, which is you sort of feel like you got to figure it out. You're kind of doing okay. So why would I pay attention to this, what is deemed to be very remote possibility, albeit leads to wipeout, right? In many cases, we've seen, obviously, not just hedge funds, but other funds and corporations even be wiped out by these kinds of events because they simply don't have them firmly on their radar screen.
It's amazing. We're in 2015, but I immediately heard from some old pros about 1987, and they were talking about a euro-dollar move. So people that had been around, they were kind of like, hey, we've seen this game before. But like you said, if your data set's only going back a few years or maybe even a few decades, it's not enough to encompass everything that you should probably imagine could go wrong.
Exactly, and that's always, look, and this is now, I think, probably, really since Nassim Taleb wrote The Black Swan, but this idea has been around. Benoit Mandelbrot wrote about it in the 1960s, that if you do study a series of prices in almost whatever you want, commodities or currencies or even equities, or we do know that there are these relatively infrequent but very large scale events, and you have to take these things somehow into consideration when you're investing. And it might be through your time horizon. In other words, if you look back, then the crash in 1987 looks like a blip, so maybe it's just time horizon. It might be other ways of insuring against these sort of adverse outcomes. But you're absolutely right, and hopefully almost all investment professionals are aware of this now. But it goes back to what I was mentioning before. I think there are incentive issues. If you are doing well and you're getting well compensated without having to take these things into consideration, they're going to blindside you. Your incentives just don't allow you to introduce them into the thinking the way they should be.
Let me ask one more topical conversation or topical point for this particular conversation. So this fantastically, I think it's fair to say perhaps unexpected move in oil over the last 6-7 months. So when you look at your toolbox and you think about the various ways that you're analyzing markets, players, behaviors, how do you visualize, how do you think about, when you're just talking to yourself, how do you think about that oil move?
Well, I think there are two dimensions to this. One is, many commodities, I would start with the foundations of supply and demand. And I think that that is still a very appropriate way to think about these things. Now, certain commodities, and oil being one of them, these tend to be very slow cycles. In other words, if prices go up, the investment comes in, but it takes some time for that investment to click into place. Or if the prices go down, there's disinvestment, but it takes time. So this is moving a big ship around. So those supply, the supply issues may change at a rate that's much slower than demand and the price signals. So that's the first aspect, is I would still go supply demand. The second thing, which is really interesting, and Mike, I think you and I have talked about this over the years, is that what we know is there are in markets, there are nonlinear components to it, right? In other words, information may start to leak into the market, and people start to think about it, but they're not weighting it very heavily. And then there's almost a flick of a switch, you start to see these fairly sizable moves. So it's not so much that there's anything that's particularly revealed that's new, but there's sort of a nonlinearity in price movements. And we see this, by the way, it's obviously in physical systems, these notion of phase transitions, which we see, the most straightforward one is going from 33 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit in water is a phase transition for the state of going from a liquid to a solid. But we see these also all over the place in social systems as well. So these are, they're popularized with concepts like tipping points and so forth. But these are very powerful phenomena. So when you combine, I think, to me, that story, my uninformed view of it would be a combination of those two things. One is the basic fundamentals of supply and demand, and how it's really hard to get your arms around lags. And then the second component is sort of the nonlinearity, which does tend to take people by surprise.
Well, you make the connection from your world perspective. You say, look, there's the fundamentals, and then there's the expectation or the price. We have to understand, all of us have to understand that those aren't necessarily going to be aligned at all times.
I love that point, and I just think that if you said to me, what is the single greatest mistake in the investment industry, I would say you just put your finger on it, right? Which is a failure to distinguish between those two things. And the metaphor that's the easiest to grasp is a racetrack, right? Where you go to the racetrack and there are odds on the board, which is pari-mutuel bettors. It's a specification of the expectation of the performance of the horse. And then there's the fundamentals, which is how fast the horse is going to run. And so those two things, and by the way, in those cases, we run the race, so we actually know what the outcome is. And so it's very explicit. But in markets, you're getting the expectations of prices, so you have to basically reverse engineer from the prices what's expected in terms of performance. And what happens, I think the natural thing, and all of us do this, right? When things are going well, you both because you've done well typically if you're long, and psychologically you want to be part of it, right? And if things are going badly, you want to sell it. And so I think psychologically struggle because the price itself is giving us, it's not only giving us information, it's also influencing us. I think that's the key. So the price is influencing us in a way that blurs this fundamentals and expectations distinction. So I would just say the great investors, I think one of the characteristics of all great investors is that they always demarcate fundamentals and expectations, and they're very disciplined about it. And that's a really good lesson to learn, especially when you're young, to think about those two things as separately as you possibly can.
Yeah, of course, and you know from my world, there's some traders that just say, and I'm not trying to make a value judgment on one strategy or the other, but there's some traders that just say, by gosh, we're so confused by the fundamentals, we're just going to go straight to the expectation and just trade that.
Yeah, and I think that, part of it is, the reason I think it's actually an easier thing to do is because it's a little bit like, rather than guessing the score of a football game, you're just taking over-unders, right? So you don't need to get the details right, you just need to be sort of directionally correct, right? So if expectations are really, really lofty, all you have to say to yourself is, the probability they do much better is not high, the probability they do not as good, not well is high, so I'll buy it, or I'll put the trade on to take advantage of that. And likewise, expectations are low. So that's right, it's more like an over-under. It's like where the bar is set for the high jumper, rather than knowing exactly how high the jumper can jump. All you need to know is where the bar is, the probability that person can clear it.
One of the things in the last couple of years, not the only thing by any stretch of the imagination, but you have really taken the mantle with the notion, the discussion, pushing the debate, pushing the conversation forward, the notion of trading profits, luck or skill. So as many times as you've talked about this subject, and I know you've talked about it extensively, I've listened to many of them, is there something, a feedback or a fight that you hear from people? Are there people that hear that analysis and just say, no, Michael? Is there something is there something they miss and they want to fight? Because it's so damn logical and rational. So I want to know who fights you on this, if anybody.
Yeah. It's funny because I think that almost everybody to an individual can recognize it in other fields. So when you talk about some others, a sport, if you're a trader, you talk about sports, they can see it. But it tends to be, they tend to be a little looser when they're coming closer to home. No, I think what happens is, for most of us, and there's a very fundamental reason for this. If you perceive that you're in control, so you're a trader and you've got your trading process and you're doing your thing every day, certainly everything about what you're doing suggests that you're skilled, right? Because it's your volition, you're doing it, it's your process, you're putting the trades on and so forth. All your feedback is that's skill related. As a consequence, I think most of us, especially if you're successful, you're almost always going to naturally chalk that up to your skill. That your hard work and your effort and your process are what made it happen. The challenge is that this idea that we call the paradox of skill. I should be clear, it's not my idea, but we gave it that name. The paradox of skill says, when you think about skill, you have to think about it on two levels. The first is absolute skill, right? Which is just how good you are, your tools, an athlete, it would be their athletic performance and so forth. The second way of thinking about skill is relative. I think the basic generalization we can make is, as you look out around the world, that absolute skill has never been higher everywhere you look, right? Athletics, in business, certainly in investments, right? We have access to incredible information and trading systems and computers and so forth, right? But at the same time, relative skill, I think, has also never been narrower, which is to say the difference between the very best and the average is less today than it was a generation or two before. Differential skill is less on average. I'm not saying it's gone away, but it's less. So as a consequence, notwithstanding our absolute levels of skill has never been higher, more is being left to luck. And that's a very difficult thing for people to get their arms around, right? Or their heads wrapped around, I should say. So to me, that's the contrast, which is everything, you and I do our jobs and we're saying, well, we're doing it. It's us, right? And we're working hard and we're focused and we're trying to do the best we can. Everything about that says that it's skill, which is true. The problem is everybody else is doing the same thing. So when you're talking about dealing with markets and prices, that information for the most part gets expressed, and hence more is being left to luck. So it's funny you say that, because I think people can, when you talk about luck in sports, for instance, all investors, they can see it and they can see it, they can understand the quantitative case for it, but it's much harder to do when you are thinking about yourself.
Are there any scientific principles of luck?
Well, it's a fundamentally important question to pose about definitions of luck. And, I won't go into it in any great detail, but, if I threw the word out luck, you often hear people talk about chance or fortune. And all these, of course, they have etymologies. They come from different places and they mean somewhat different things. So the first important thing is to define luck. The definition I settled on for the book was one that came from a philosopher. And he basically said luck exists when there are three conditions in place. One is it operates for an individual organization, right? So it happens to you or your trading book or your favorite sports team or what have you. Second is it can be good or bad. And the suggestion is not that it's symmetrical, but that there is a plus sign possible and a negative sign possible. And the third, and I think the vital one, which is it is reasonable to expect a different outcome could have occurred. In other words, if we rewound the tape of time and we play it again, it's reasonable to expect a different outcome. So when those three things in place, I think you have luck. And then with that little, if that's a valid or reasonable definition, then you start to think about what would you define as luck and what's not in your luck, right? So one of the things I like to say is skill is basically what is in your control, and luck is what is outside of your control. So there are all these great aphorisms about luck. You know, when I tell people, I've done some work on skill and luck, they go, oh yeah, I know all about that. Yeah. Luck is where preparation meets opportunity. Or, the harder I work, the luckier I get, right? And these things pour out of people, and they of course have a very positive message, right? Which is work hard or prepare. I mean, and certainly those are messages we want to encourage, and we tell our kids those things, right? But if you accept my definition of luck, or this philosopher's definition of luck, those really aren't luck, right? You can't improve your luck. Those are things in your control, and hence they're going to, in our definition, are going to fall into the category of skill. So that's the way I like to think about it, and I think many traders think about it this way too, which is do everything you can within your power to succeed, and then understand that some days are going to be good and some days are going to be bad as a consequence of luck, things that are outside of your control. If you're an athlete, you focus on your preparation, whether what the weather is or how the referee does things. Those are things that are not in your control. So dwell on what you can control and separate yourself from things that you can't control, and then just move on. And there's this that great John Wooden definition of success, right, which is basically that you've done everything you can within your power. That is success. You've achieved all you can given who you are, and I think that's right. And everything else above and beyond that is what's outside of your control are things you have to have almost a philosophical bent about them. Just take them as they come.
You mentioned athletes, and I was thinking of a great example. Of course, we can rattle off success stories in the fund management arena that were one big bet, and then there's a coronation that is now the superstar after one big bet. And I think what's really interesting in the most recent NFL game, Green Bay, Seattle, anybody that's watching that game, looking at the highlights, whatnot, easily could have gone the other way. But then once it goes the way of Seattle, instead of us really fixating on how fine a line it was and that luck was clearly involved, then there's the coronation. Well, Seattle's, they're on to the second Super Bowl. It's really interesting how we essentially rise. Once there's a kind of perhaps a lucky victory, we rise the winner of the lucky side up to this new pedestal, when the reality is it was pretty dang narrow.
Well, I think that, it's interesting that some NFL analytics websites have real-time probabilities of winning. As you're watching the game, you can see their real-time probabilities, and the Packers were well over 90%. So that game was, from a statistical point of view, close to being wrapped up. And you're exactly right. So if you do that scenario 100 times, I don't know what it is, 90 or 95% of the time the Packers win. The Seahawks win 5 or 10%. But it introduces, I think, some very, very important concepts that people need to be very aware of, investors and traders in particular. And I would say that the way I would think about it is, they're all related to outcome bias, right? Which is once you've seen an outcome, so you know the answer, what all of us do naturally, effortlessly, is we create a narrative to explain that outcome, right? And then we file it in our minds. And as we create that narrative, two things tend to happen. It very well describe what you just mentioned with this whole football game. One is called hindsight bias, which we start to believe that we knew what was going to happen with a greater probability than we actually did, right? Oh yeah, I knew all along that the Seahawks were hanging in there, whatever it is. And the second is called creeping determinism, which is we start to believe that what happened was the only thing that could have happened. And it's exactly as you said, these narratives, former Super Bowl team, the pride of the team, what have you, right? So we almost reshape our narrative to explain the outcome once we know the outcome. Mm. And it's actually a very, very dangerous way of thinking. By the way, it's very natural. I should be clear about that. And we all do it. Left to our own devices, we all create these stories. But this idea of outcome bias really clouds our ability to assess the quality of our thinking and the quality of our decision making. By the way, I mentioned even on the Packers game, if you look at sort of statistical approaches to football, the Packers had a couple situations early in the game where they chose to kick field goals versus going for touchdowns. Now, it was not a sure thing that it's 4th and 1 on the 1 yard line, or 4th and goal on the 1 yard. It's not a sure thing you're going to score a touchdown, but it's an expected value, right? So you score 50% of the time, it's 0.5 times 7, it's 3.5 expected points versus kicking a field goal, which is 3 points, whatever it is. You just think about, they had 2 of those situations. Had they scored one of those touchdowns, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, right? So even along the way, these guys were making decisions that culminated to that sort of crescendo. Again, we just keep pulling out stories to explain what we've seen. And again, it's not just football, it's anything, sports. And as you point out, the one-trick wonders in investing. My point is, everybody, as I always like to say to people, someone's got every trade on at some point, right? So no matter what happens in the world, someone's going to look good, and others are going to look bad. Pointing to the person that did particularly want a particular situation is, first of all, you might applaud them, give them a little golf clap or something, but only if they can repeat that over time in some systematic fashion do you truly say that they know what they're doing. So this is another thing called the halo effect, which is we find success and then we go backward and say, what were those people doing? That's another very perilous way to think.
I was thinking, or I was mentioning it early in the podcast about guests on my show that perhaps I was inspired to ask via you, Daniel Kahneman, Vernon Smith, Daniel Simons, Laurie Santos, Barry Schwartz, Hersh Sheffrin, Meyer Statman. The list goes on. You're right there with them. So for yourself, many of your peers, all of this great behavioral work, and we can all go on Amazon, and there's fantastic books out there that basically just pick us apart. I mean, I love talking to Laurie Santos. She basically breaks it down to the monkey level, giving monkeys money, and it's kind of been figured out in many ways. Has it made a dent, though? Is it got into the general public consciousness, or are we at? Do you see where I'm going with that? I mean, where are we in that process of education?
It's a fascinating question and a very fundamental question, and I think that there's no way. I think it'd be very hard to argue that the general awareness of many of these principles is less today than it was 20 years ago. And so you say Kahneman, Tversky, and let's say where those guys really started to formalize a couple sets of ideas, heuristics and biases, and ultimately prospect theory. So how we deviate from more normative economic theory. Those things have been around now for some time, and I think if you go to most investors and say, do you understand roughly what overconfidence and framing and so forth, I think most people understand that. The challenge, exactly to your point, is actually weaving this into your day-to-day processes, and I think that the next step of managing and mitigating these kinds of cognitive mistakes is where we need to put our effort today. And I think that so we've actually made, I think, quite little advancement in this. So it becomes some really interesting questions about what to do about that. We wrote a piece last year called Methods to Improve Decisions. And it was an explicit effort to try to introduce a handful of tools that an investor or an investment organization could try to put into place to at least make a dent on this problem. But it's not easy. The other thing to me is what's also interesting is we need to distinguish, and we talked about this a few moments ago. We really need to distinguish between two things, and I think that many people don't make this distinction clear enough. The first is how you and I operate as individuals. So somebody could put a spotlight on us and follow us around and see how we make decisions. And in doing so, by the way, it's very clear that individuals are suboptimal. They're not making perfect decisions. But the second level of analysis is that of the market itself, which is really the collective of individuals. So as a consequence, we go from psychology to really sociology, how groups interact. And there's another area where I think that it's very difficult for people to make that jump. I'm persuaded that for as long as you and I are on this earth, we're going to continue to see these collective behaviors of, euphoria and despair, and these markets running to extremes. What we know is markets are generally pretty good, and we also know that markets episodically go to extremes. And I'm just not sure there's anything, whether in the literature or in our learning, that suggests that pattern is going to stop anytime soon. The booms and busts have been happening for as long as, from the first time the first market opened up, right? If you're a historian of the market, this has been going on for 400 or 500 years. I'm not sure it's going to stop anytime soon. So that's, but I would just say, if you're a trader or an investment professional, the thing you really want to think about is what can you do in your environment and in your process to help you manage or mitigate the kinds of cognitive mistakes you're likely to make, right? So you have to embed it in your process and embed it in your environment. That's the key. So it's offloaded to some degree. It's whether it's checklists or certain procedures you go through to make sure you've thought about things thoroughly. You need to offload it to your environment and your process to make sure that you're doing the best you can.
Let me dovetail one last question into that response and where I went with that initially. So you've been a professor, you've taught young people. I'm curious your perspective on where we are today in the classroom for those pursuing the MBA, the finance degree. Have the tracks moved? Are younger people getting a different vantage at this since they're not, it's thrown at them at a young age. They're not having to learn it all as we've all had to see it come out. Is there a difference in how young people are accepting these subjects?
It's a great question. I think that, certainly the possibility of learning about these things is much greater today than it was a generation or two ago. As you point out, I'm starting my 23rd year at Columbia Business School. And when I first started, there were no behavioral finance courses. And what I would recommend the students do is go take a negotiation course, because that was the one area where you could start to get some of this stuff, some of these ideas were leaking in. Now there are these behavioral courses. But I have a personal anecdote on this that really brought this home to me. One of my son's high schools decided to start a Center for Leadership, which is fantastic. And of course I applauded that. And then they decided, what are the key cores to our curriculum? And so they lay out their cores, and they're all things that were certainly fine and admirable. But what was not included was decision making. So there was no discussion about how leaders should make decisions. So I went to the head of the school and I said, first of all, I think this is great and so forth, but I'm not sure that we can, in a serious fashion, talk about leadership without providing these young men and women with the tools to think about decision making. It was almost like a surprise. So I think that you can certainly go through school today as a young person, through high school and through college, and not really get concrete exposure to these concepts on decision making. That is something I would like to see. I know there are a couple initiatives out there. I would like to see that much more explicit. Even things like, understanding the scientific method and how that can inform the quality of your thinking. Understanding, as we've talked about before, heuristics and biases. Understanding how our minds work and how we love to attach causes and effects, and as a consequence, that messes up the way we think about a lot of things. And just get people to think. As you mentioned, one of the first things you talked about is appealing to the outside view, these reference classes, these base rates, versus only our own experiences, our own intuitions, and trying to bring that suite of tools to our young people. Now, I think that probably junior high school or I guess they call it middle school, is probably a little young for that. But certainly our juniors and seniors in high school, and certainly our college students, are fully capable of understanding all these concepts, and we should be much more explicit in teaching them. So I think we've made progress. That stuff is out there, but there's much more. There's much more that we can do. I try to talk to my own kids about this stuff, and using the kinds of terms that we've been talking about. I think there's not enough of it out there.
I think one of the things that young people should be lucky about is that they can reach out some of the names that I rattled off. And I was thinking of one more, Gerd Gigerenzer. All of these guys are accessible. They're all out there. And there's they open their mouths and it's just so much wisdom comes out. So I think that's one of the great opportunities with all this technology for distributing communication. It's just fantastic.
I agree with that. And Gigerenzer is a great example where, people struggle with understanding probabilities. One of his prescriptions is to change everything over to natural numbers, right? So instead of saying 2%, you say 2 out of 100. And 2 out of 100 is a lot easier to understand and visualize because it's much more concrete than 2%. So going from the abstract to the concrete helps people think in their thinking enormously. And so all these tricky probability problems, which can trip up even a statistician, and certainly people like physicians and people who should know better, translate it over to natural numbers, and everybody gets it, right? So it's stuff like that where you say, everybody should have those tools in their toolbox, right? Everybody.
It's fun stuff, Michael. I like I said, you've inspired me to go off on these, I want to affectionately call them tangents for the last 15 years. So listen, your books, More Than You Know, The Success Equation, Think Twice. You are on Twitter. You post really cool stuff on Twitter. People should follow you just for that alone so they can take advantage of all the free work that you're doing for them. Where else can we send them in terms of your major URL?
I think that's it, Mike. I mean, I have michaelmobison.com, but I don't post much stuff there. But that's where you can see all these, and there's some chapters in the books and so forth. Yeah, so that's those. You hit all the highlights.
No, Michael, listen, I appreciate you coming on. Hopefully, we can talk again in the future. Always great,
Mike. My pleasure. Take care.
Take care.
Now, for the third episode of this mega aggregation of content, Charles Poliquin.
Charles, my first question. Considering my audience, and my audience is diverse, and I have a lot of diverse guests on my show, I would love to know the connective tissue, the rationale, the reason, how it came to be that you and Ed Seykota have connected.
We're producing together a seminar for executives who want to improve their performance. Obviously, within the training community, is highly respected. And in my community, I'm highly respected, but I've worked with a lot of executives by default. So my background is to work with Olympic athletes and professional athletes, and I had a very successful business doing so. Elite athletes tend to associate with elite people in the business world, and they used to come to my center. So I saw the need for developing educational programs, because if you look at the successful executive, his mindset is very much the same as an Olympic athlete, but they just have different goals. But their mindset is the same, but they also have the same problems like concentration, sleep, memory, and so on.
But let me take you a step back. I want to dig deeper here. I want to know how you and Ed connected for the first time.
We've actually never connected face-to-face yet. It was through a colleague of mine who had done a lot of his work, and she reached out to him to connect the two of us.
You just saw the instant, the way he's thinking, the way you think, the way, even though it's different disciplines, you saw the commonality just instantly, I assume.
Correct. Success leaves clues. There's a lot of things that successful people do that are common, whether it's Schwarzenegger or Ed or the world champion in powerlifting or the Olympic medalist in shot put. There's a lot of things that are the same. For example, the growth mindset, the ability to take calculated risk, and so on.
As we start this episode, I want to read something from your website that I thought was great. It really made me think immediately, and it was very simple. Just a few sentences. Let me read this through really quick for the audience so they have some perspective as to where we're going to go today. There is no such thing as discipline. There is only love. Love is the most powerful creative force in the universe. You are the result of what you love most. You either love finely etched muscular abs more than donuts, or you love donuts more than washboard abs you could do your laundry on. It is simple as that. Don't beat yourself up that you have no discipline or further drown yourself in a sea of refined carbs out of guilt. Admit that you like crappy food more than you love strength. That sums it up, doesn't it?
Very true, because, you look at it, you have two ways you can make choices in life. You can make choices out of fear, you can make choices out of love. If you make all your choices out of love, you're going to be very successful and very happy. If all your choices are fear-based, you're not going to go anywhere in life.
It's simple, but there's so much depth behind that, because a significant part of the population, including myself at some points in time, we all result back to the fear motivation.
Correct. I mean, it's human nature, but, especially if you grew up Catholic like I did, I mean, shame and blame were the two motivating forces, right? You were taught to fear and feel shame, and your parents would blame you, and that fosters a lot of negative output in your life. If you say to yourself, okay, everything I'm going to do from now on is based on love. Do I prefer to have a healthy life with my children than my grandchildren? Then you'll make the right choices. But if you prefer to stuff yourself with Krispy Kremes, then you prefer yourself to stuff with Krispy Kremes. But at the end, there's no discipline. I think that discipline is a myth. And that article is actually my most popular article on this website, and the one that is most translated. I think we're up to 76 languages it's been translated in. So I figured that out a long time ago. For people who were successful, they didn't really experience the economy of discipline. It's just they love doing this more than anything else.
You mentioned your religious background, and now I look at you today and I see words like sensei as part of your vocabulary. So clearly you've made a transition, and I'm gathering from using a phrase like sensei that many of the Eastern traditions have drowned out perhaps some of your initial religious upbringing.
I was Canada's second youngest black belt at the age of 14. And I've done 6 different martial arts. But what I think about the Eastern philosophies is that the vision of what you do and the consequences is very different than I grew up as a Catholic, So I'm more into karma and Buddhist trends in my life just by having done both and seeing what it does to what it did to my life and what it does on a daily basis.
Why don't we go back in time, though, since you just mentioned your youth, and I think for most people, most males, even if they were competitive athletes, and I played baseball into my first year in college, but to hear as a 14-year-old black belt, we, for those of us that did some sports, we know that that's a certain amount of dedication, certain amount of athletic prowess. Why don't you talk about yourself as a young man and what was driving you to some of that early athletic achievement?
Well, to be fair, when people ask me what you want to do when you grow up, I wanted to be Tarzan. I thought you had the ideal lifestyle, didn't have to wear clothes, they were too fancy, could exercise every day, save the world. Early on, I thought Tarzan was the man. And then a man tried to molest me when I was 10 years old. And I luckily survived. And then my father said, you need to do something to protect yourself. So I said, can I do karate? So I started to do karate, but as soon as I put my gi the first day, I fell in love with the activity. I love it in the fact that you have to be concentrated. You can't have ADD and be a black belt in karate. So, the power of focus, breaking my first board, and so on. And then what happened is that one day, back then you had to listen to the news to know what the weather was going to be. They forecasted a snowstorm. That was a Friday night. So it's okay, the buses won't run as usual because there'd be too much snow. So I woke up extra early, had breakfast, and walked to the dojo. And there was short and young, and had snow up to my knees, and I just walked all the way there. And then once I got to the dojo, I was the only kid who showed up. Not because I had discipline, because I loved karate more than staying at home and watching cartoons. So my sensei said to me, I'll drive you home, but since I'm already here, I'm going to work out. And I said, what do you mean you're going to work out? Because I'm going to lift weights. Well, in 1975, people who lifted weights were actual weirdos. They were a subculture. They used to hang around together. So the weightlifters, the powerlifters, the bodybuilders, they all hang around. There was no such a thing as separate gyms. There was just the iron that was a common friend. I said, well, can I do it? And he goes, sure. So, and there's such a thing in my field called the iron bug. And I got bit by the iron bug that same morning. I really loved it. So I said, okay, I'm going to lift. So I asked my older brother, can I get some weights? And he was the first one to give me those cement block wrapped in plastic cheap weights, with a rusted bar that I spent my Sunday afternoon unrusting with foil, getting rid of the rust. And then every time I had some spare money, I would buy, little plates and more weight. At the age of 17, after working as a waiter in Japanese restaurants, I was able to afford a Swedish Olympic barbell, which was, they're still the best in the world. Bought that, and I started training athletes out of my house. One guy at the gym who was a national volleyball team said, hey, man, you're pretty strong. Can you write me my program? I was already in first year university, and that was my first national team athlete I started to train. So that's how it started. It was just me showing up because I wanted to do karate. There's no karate because of the snowstorm, and I lifted weights, fell in love with it. Even my sensei, which I see on a regular basis, was very proud that I chose to name myself the Strength Sensei, because in my first book, I acknowledged that he's the man who showed me how to lift weights first.
As you mentioned this rather traumatic event that happened in your youth, and then you mentioned shifting to the martial arts and weightlifting. This traumatic event that happens, obviously there's feelings of like, wow, I don't have full control here, or I can't defend myself as much as I'd like. At what age were you when you knew pretty much you could defend yourself as a male against all comers. And if you couldn't defend yourself, perhaps you were going to die. But when was that moment, that age where you knew after all this training and all this work that you could defend yourself and nothing was going to ever happen to you again?
Probably by age 12, I was already a blue belt. So, it's not a black belt yet, but I had enough skills to realize that I could do it, And then once I started to lift weights, of course, that went exponentially. And over the years, I've done a lot of different martial arts because there's not a perfect martial art. I would say 12 was the start of the inflection point in the curve. And then another point at age 14 when I started to lift weights. There was no looking back after that. But
what was that feeling, though? That feeling of at one point being, okay, I don't have complete control, or I feel a little that someone can hurt me. What was that feeling like to where, because I don't think some people ever get this feeling of control and the ability to defend themselves. And of course, many women, my girlfriend is a smaller lady, she's never going to have the sense of, she's actually participating in martial arts too, and she's pretty tough, but she's never going to be the size of perhaps you, of course. And so that feeling that you had where you go at one moment, wow, I don't have control, but that inner feeling of like, I know I can take care of myself. That's a special transition, isn't it?
Yes, but you know what? It's like I always tell in my classes, once you're the alpha wolf, then you don't have to prove anything, One of my favorite authors is Robert Sapolsky, who wrote Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. One of his best books is A Primate's Memoir, where he describes how monkeys, social hierarchy is built around confidence and so on. You could say that it does have a dramatic effect on your confidence. And there were other incidences where I did actually need to apply my skills, but it was nice to know that I could do it.
Predators avoid confidence, don't they?
Correct. That's why they pick on kids. The thing that saved my life is that scene in an Hercules movie. You'll laugh. I saw an Hercules movie. A bad guy was fighting Hercules, and he threw sand in Hercules' face. So I was smaller than, of course, the predator, and I was playing with cars, and there was like gravel. And I knew I was in danger. So I just grabbed the gravel, threw it in his face, ran to my neighbor's backyard, jumped over the fence, which I did every day, and then got back to my parents' house and alerted my brother, who chased the guy. But it's kind of funny that I got the trick to get out of that situation by watching a Hercules movie.
Charles, I saw some pretty sure recent pictures of you, and I'd love to know your age, because physically, if I see those pictures, I'm saying to myself that most men, regardless of age, including guys in their late teens, early 20s, would be, I don't necessarily want to say jealous. I don't think jealous, but I think perhaps they might be envious, or perhaps they might be inspired. So how old are you right now, Charles?
I'm 54.
I think a great jumping off point. There's a lot of males that listen to my podcast, and I see, in my world, I see all different types of physical prowess in men. I see young programmers at 22 whose bodies just look atrocious. And I'm 47. I can go out and run sprints at the track. I do yoga all the time. I do CrossFit. I swim. I try to. I'm engaged. But I see so many young guys that are not, and older guys too. But I think what I think would be a great inspirational time for you right now is to perhaps speak to those people that either have an excuse, or they've given up, or they don't realize that the body is pretty malleable, and it will recover in many ways if you just give it a little work, right?
Correct. There's studies that were done in Florida with 90-year-old males, so it's not like they're actually chicken springs, and they can do, if they lift weights 3 days a week, 40 minutes, after 12 weeks, their biological age reverses to age 55, right? So that means that a 90-year-old man is better than a 75-year-old man, 65-year-old man, et cetera, et cetera. So he's back down to 55, and that's only after a few months of strength training.
What's going on there physically? How does that take place?
Well, there's a phenomenon called sarcopenia, which, if you look at the etymology of the word, it means muscle death. So as you age, some of your muscle cells simply die because of inactive use. And also what happens is that you also get what we call fat marbling. So the spine muscles tend to look like Kobe beef. It's full of fat. The muscle is marble with inflammatory fat. In the spine muscles of these 90-year-old, what you see is that if you start training them, those muscle fibers atrophy, but the fat marbling is gone. The most important thing to remember, Michael, is the concept of progression, not perfection. I think what happens is that what discourages people is that they want perfection and they want it 3 weeks ago. The most common question, yesterday I was doing a consult for a client, and the guy was only 34, his body fat was over 40%. And I said to him, listen, progression, not perfection. And then how long did it take you to get fat? And the guy laughed. And I said, well, don't expect miracles. I don't walk on water. But I said, you could be in decent shape where people notice it by the end of the year. So by Christmas, we're just in October. If you do October, November, December, people will notice. I guarantee, because I've done it plenty of times. And it's like anything else, If I want dental work, I don't go see a garage man. If I want financial advice, I don't see a policeman. So you have to, if you don't know what you're doing, get some help. And even if the person just designs you a program and shows you how to do it, for a mere $75, you're better off than trying to figure it out yourself. Always hire expertise, and that will save you time. I think that's the best way to get to it. And the thing is that you could get the most important thing that I tell people is that there's a huge mathematical difference between training 4 days a week versus training 3 days a week. So I tell people, can you commit 4 hours a week to training? Yes. And then let's say Monday, Thursday, Tuesday, Friday, split the body in half. In 4 months, people won't recognize me. It's not that much work, and the most important thing is to avoid cardio, because cardio further stresses the adrenal glands. It makes you insulin resistant. So strength training, even the top cardiologists like Bijan Porat will tell you that the best way to avoid cardiovascular disease is actually strength training.
Talk about the cardio aspect again, because I've seen you use the expression, and I've actually heard it quite a bit too, skinny fat. So talk about skinny fat and how cardio affects this ultimate result of skinny fat. Define skinny fat.
Well, skinny fat is a person with low muscle mass but high percentage of body fat. So they may look thin, but the quality of the body is horrendous. So, people think that marathon runners are lean. They have lean limbs, but they take their shirt off. They don't look so lean because they're not lean. There's 6 major problems with cardiovascular work. I'm talking about slow, long-distance work. I'm not talking about interval training, so let's make that difference. But people go for a run, let's say a 20-minute run or a 20-minute bike ride, 20-minute row, but at an even pace. My biggest peeve is brain aging. What we know now is that the more cardiovascular, low, long-distance type someone has done, the faster their brains have aged. So at the Olympic levels, the athletes with the worst brain functions are like cross-country skiers, rowers, and so on. And all the anaerobic sport, the short-term explosive sports, the guys still have their heads, right?
That's just fascinating comment. Break that apart for us.
Well, the thing is that when you do aerobic work, the slow, long-distance one, you make this stress hormone called cortisol. Well, cortisol oxidizes your brain. In English, it means it rusts your brain. It makes damage to your brain. The same way metal, you can have cast iron and it turns it to rust. Well, that's, iron plus oxygen. When you do a lot of aerobic work, your brain actually gets older. Who wants to get older in the brain? I mean, everybody that I know, my age group, wants to have a younger brain. They realize they only got one, and they've got to take good care of it. So that's my number one pet peeve with aerobic work. Second thing is that Dr. Schwartzbein, who's probably the best endocrinologist in relation to diabetes, is against aerobic work because she says that fat people who do aerobic work actually worsen their health at the adrenal level, but also the insulin sensitivity issue. And then, Alzheimer's is now considered type 3 diabetes, in other words, late age diabetes. And then when you become more insulin resistant from cardio, you actually accelerate brain aging from another means, okay? Reason number 4 I don't like cardiovascular work is that you will need amino acids from your body to repair the damage, which is normal. But the body has only so much of an amino acid pool, right? And the amino acid pool, you have to make choices. So the amino acids that go towards cardiovascular recovery are not going towards muscle recovery. Tufts University in 1982 demonstrated that the best predictor of how old you're going to live is actually muscle mass. Number 2 predictor is actually strength. So those beat things like blood pressure, cholesterol profile, inflammation profiles, and so on. So if you look at it, Michael, the top 2 things that will show that could predict accurately how old you're going to live is number 1, muscle mass, number 2, strength. And we know from a physiological standpoint that cardiovascular work interferes with muscle strength and muscle mass.
Contrast for something like long distance running and the jogging and what people typically think of as good, healthy stuff. Now, for the last 3 or 4 years, I've tried to keep up a fairly regular sprinting practice. I'll go out to the track with some friends or whatever, and I'll probably try to do, just depending on how I feel, 6 to 10, 80 to 100 meter sprints, full bore. I mean, we might not be at the track for 20 to 30 minutes, but after that, I'm done. I don't have anything left. I give it all that I got, and I'm not trying to do any kind of crazy distance, but I have to tell you, the feeling that I have at that moment and the next couple days, and then what it does to my body in terms of people say, hey, sit-ups. I'm sprinting. Am I completely crazy?
No, you're actually exactly on the right track. So look at it this way. We're designed to throw a rock at a rabbit or run and throw a rock at a rabbit, or we're not designed to run after the rabbit. So basically, when we do sprints, we're mimicking how we used to feed ourselves. So let's say if you want to kill a bison and you do a 100-meter sprint to throw him a javelin or spear, that makes sense. So sprints are great for you because you got to look at the hormonal response of a sprint versus long-distance cardio. It's completely different. One of the things that happens when you do sprints is you produce more of this hormone called growth hormone. And growth hormone is what repairs connective tissue in your body. Growth hormone is what burns fat. Growth hormone is the hormone that prevents you to lose muscle mass with age. So the more growth hormone you produce, the better you're off. But the best way to do that is either strength training or sprinting.
Let me throw something out about weightlifting. So I probably started weight training at the age of 12, and I was really dedicated until about the age of 19, 21. And I took about 8 to 10 years off, and now in a CrossFit type regimen and some kettlebell work. I'm not by any stretch doing what I was doing when I was like 20, which is really heavy squats and really heavy bench press. But one of the myths that people have about weight training is that, okay, these young guys are going to do all this weight training, they're going to increase their muscle mass, and then when they get old, they're going to be fat. And here's the worst thing about that thought, is that thought gets connected to something like the current pictures that one of the most infit men ever in terms of weights, Arnold Schwarzenegger, goes out now at the age of 68 and walks around the beach, and people go, oh, that confirms my view. Arnold Schwarzenegger did all this weight work, and now look at him now. Why don't you break that apart for people? Those are some really wrong conclusions, aren't they?
Correct. I mean, I haven't seen recent pictures of Schwarzenegger, but let's say if there's a case where his body fat is up and he used to be shredded. Well, there's also the contrast. In other words, there's a difference between 2% body fat when you're 35 years old and you weigh 110 kilos of muscle mass versus he's 68 years old. His priorities have obviously changed in life. But the ones I've seen recently, and actually I saw him maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I saw some pictures 3 or 4 years ago and he was, just having fun or something. But no, but because I went to a VIP lecture group because I was teaching at the Arnold Classic in Melbourne. Even wearing jeans and a shirt, I wouldn't say I would call him fat. So maybe it was because he was going through his divorce 4 years ago. You don't know what the exact circumstances, but from at least when I saw him in March, he looked pretty good.
The bigger issue that I really want you to address is the idea that just doing weights and increasing muscle mass, that the issue is if you do weights and increase muscle mass and then you stop exercising, it doesn't make a difference whether you did weights or not. If you stop exercising and eat bad, you're going to look bad. It's not connected to the weights.
Correct. And the other thing that we know from years of experience is that when you stop weight training, and let's say you've done it for 3 decades and you stop, you tend to return to the genotype you have. So, if you're an ectomorph, you go back to being skinny. If you had a tendency to be obese, you'll go back to obesity. So, but it certainly doesn't turn into fat because they're 2 different chemical reactions. So if you stop, let's say you live for 4 decades and you stop lifting, if you are fat now, it's because of the wrong choices you made. But you're 100% right. It's not muscle turning into fat. Is you starting to say, okay, you're going to lose that muscle mass because if you don't use it, you lose it. So, and then the other thing is, for example, I saw pictures of John Travolta in shape, and John Travolta, when he shirt off, he had the shape of a melted candle, right?
That's probably a better example than my Schwarzenegger example.
Or you see actors who get in shape for a movie like Superman or some action hero, and then they stop. Then, if they go back and eat pretzels and drink beer and sit on their butts watching reality shows, well, obviously they're going to get fat like anybody else does. It's not magic.
Talk about this. So one of your expressions that I know you're fond of saying, train like it's your last workout. So that requires a certain toughness mentally. And I'm curious, any advice you could give myself, other people listening, train like it's your last workout. I know that is tough as hell mentally. What are some of the ways that one can go about it? Or are you just going to come back to the love concept? Meaning, if you're going to, you have to want to train like it's your last workout because of love. Or are there any ideas and thoughts that you can give for people to toughen up mentally?
I think the best way to train like it's your last workout is actually to have 2 training partners, not 1, 2. I found from experience that there's always 1 out of the 3 that's up, 1 out of the 3 that's down, and 1 that's in the middle. And that role varies, right? One thing that I love to do still is betting. So I'll say, I'll bet you this, I can do that. And then when you've trained with the same guys for a long time, you know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and you make fair bets. In other words, okay, if I do, let's say, 200 kilos on this, you got to do 250 kilos because you're much bigger and larger than me. So you keep pushing each other. Usually, what I found was is bet food. So, because that's one of the most basic human things. So I'll say, okay, steak dinner if I do this, and then the guy will do, and then he could double or nothing. But that keeps it like a competitive spirit. The other thing that I find that's very important is to have goals with an expiry date. For example, I just spent the last month with Dmitry Klokov, who used to be world champion in weightlifting, silver medalist in weightlifting at the Olympics, and he retired from competition last April. And the students asked him, how do you keep that physique? He says, well, I pick a lift that's odd. He wants to do now a snatch with a 2-second pause at 200 kilos. There's no competitions for that. It's an odd lift. But he says, that's my goal this year. So mentally, he can't compare it to what he's done at the Olympics, but he's going to do something pretty impressive if you know the sport of weightlifting to do. I found that the guys who stay in shape are still into goal setting. Because if it doesn't have an expiry date, it doesn't mean anything. There's no pressure. I mean, one of my good friends is Ed Cohn, who was world champion 12 years in a row in powerlifting. He's also in his 50s. Even though he's out of competition, he picks whatever lift to do for his age. There's actually a guy called Brooks Kubik who wrote a book about aging and weight training. It's a really good book. And he shows you what's normal to lose with age, and he's got all the mathematical data. And once I read that book, I said, okay, well, I'm not doing too bad for 54, because on some lists I'm still 35 years old. So, that's how I motivate myself to do it. I think that it's an area where you have to engage your left brain. This is what I need to do by this date, and then that's how you stay motivated. But there's a social effect of training with two partners. For me, it's a bit hard to do because I travel so much, but I'll go to, let's say, Sydney or Kuala Lumpur or Helsinki. I'll pick one of my students and say, tomorrow, do you want to do legs together, or do you want to do back together, or do you want to do arms together? And of course, because of my status, they always want to. And my goal is to show them that I'm still the king.
Isn't that the trick? I mean, like, I love when I go out to the track this year, I can pretty much, there's only one guy, this Polish trainer who's in his late 20s, who he would beat me by a half meter or a meter, but I could beat everybody else in a sprint. And then I think back, I grew up around a bunch of wrestlers, so I have some instinctive idea about that. And, sometimes in the last couple of years, you get into some kind of wrestling screw around sessions with some young guy who's in his 20s and is in pretty good shape. And if you can still kind of get him, if you can get him off the ground and get a body slam, that's the whole thing. You've got to keep that competition going in your own head, don't you?
That's true. It's very true, Michael, because as soon as you stop wanting to be ahead, you'll regress, right? I mean, you have to be realistic. At my age, 54, I'm sure I beat pretty much a lot of guys my age. Can I beat the guys 18? No. But can I show them who's boss? Yes. So the thing is that, but sometimes I'll turn to a 35-year-old guy and I'll beat him, and then they'll go like, thanks for beating me, because now I know I got something to look for.
Right. Well, I'm sure you inspire a ton of people. I mean, just by that kind of that type of you just being you is inspirational, because people, even if they don't know you, they see pictures and the picture alone. But I'm sure it's much different if they meet you too. Hey, I want to keep digging apart some stuff here. Sleep. Talk about sleep. Sleep in your life. What you know about sleep. What lessons you can pass along about sleep.
Most of my life, I work 20 hours a day. That's a lot of hours, right? Mm. And, I didn't miss my workouts, whatever. If you were to ask me, if you redid your life, what would you do? I would say probably sleep more. People said, you're a very lucky man. Yeah, I was a very lucky man because I worked really hard and I didn't sleep. I did the work of 3 people per week, right? So that's how my luck increased when I did a volume. But having to sleep more, or knowing to sleep more, I would have reorganized my life and really picked up on priorities. When people ask me, what was a turning point for you? Well, to become a father, if you want to be a real father and take care of your child, you have to have quality time. So that's when I started to cut back on work. Luckily, I got to read Tim Ferriss' book, become friends with Tim Ferriss. And then I said, okay, I've got to put things in perspective. But I would say sleep is the most underrated factor in the elite. I think that elite people are so driven that they say, you can sleep in a cemetery. I would disagree now. If there's a lesson I want to pass on to the younger generation, is to go for quality sleep. Because in the end, Michael, the amount of quality work you can do when you sleep is enormous. And then there's a friend of mine's an MD quoted me something a few years ago. The general who sleeps wins the war. Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Churchill, all big military leaders were known to nap. So if you're not going to sleep 8 hours in a row, well, at least nap. And I'm a big believer in napping. And then you don't need to be long. A power nap with 20 minutes, in my opinion and my experience, is an extra 2 hours of sleep. So, and then there's quite a bit of evidence now, Michael, that fragmented sleep is actually good for you. So you don't have to sleep your whole 8 hours in a row. So, and apparently our ancestors did not sleep. I mean, our really old ancestors, we're talking 40,000 years ago, did not sleep 8 hours in a row. They did spread their sleep around. But I think that quality sleep is what I call an unfair advantage. And very few people know how important it is. But to repair tissue, you look at babies, I mean, they spend their time sleeping. Why? Because they're in a growth mode. But if you want to grow, you need to sleep. And I'm talking, if you want to grow your empire financially, you want to grow your strength, you want to grow your relationship, you have to be able to make the right decisions. And sleeping well is ultra important. So the general who sleeps the most wins the war.
You know, I was happy when I interviewed Tim Ferriss. My very first question I asked him was about wrestling. And I think I'm probably one of the first people that started an interview with him and asked him about wrestling. But anybody that's done some homework to truly know how he thinks would know that that's his inspirational moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tim and I always have a great time when we get to talk.
You have trained Olympic athletes, pro athletes, some of the highest achievers, the world records, all that kind of fun stuff. Give me a few names, and I want to know why. The most impressive athletes that you've worked with, one or two. I know there's probably some that come to the top. And try and explain to us novices why they're so impressive to you.
Okay, the names are probably not household names by any means, which is unfortunate. The first name I'll name is Adam Nelson. Adam Nelson is the most medal man in history in shot put. What's unique? He's very short. So he's only 1.80 meters tall. Well, the guys who would beat him beforehand would be at least 2 meters tall, 2 meters 10. So you're talking practically a midget, amongst giants. But he compensated for his lack of height through maximal power. So that guy was devoted in training. His nickname should be Captain Dopamine. I mean, this guy, if you want the right mindset, that's the guy to talk to. He's a very inspiring, very dominating, very tough guy. I mean, he would come to my gym, everybody would lift 20% more. Didn't care if they were NFL or NHL stars. He's one of those guys with charisma, but he's a guy who won a silver medal in Athens, and then 8 years later, they found the guy who beat him positive for the Athens urine sample. So they gave him his medal, his gold medals 8 years too late. That's not public knowledge. I mean, you could find it on Google if you wanted to, but I mean, for a guy to be that motivated and became world champion, it's not like he's been financed by a lot of people. I mean, this guy got there through hard work.
There's an inner drive there that, given as many athletes that you've worked with, there's an inner drive that forces you to throw that out as the first name that I ask about.
Yes. So him, for sure. The second name is a Kenyan skier who won 2 bronze medals at the Olympics, Karen Percy. And she won a silver medal at the World Championships in downhill skiing. She, for me, is my favorite athlete I've ever worked with because she exuded concentration. I've never seen anybody who could joke around between sets, and when it was her turn to train, she was literally on another planet. I wish I could see what was inside her brain, but the dedication she put into that set was very inspiring. You've heard of expressions like you have to live in the moment. Well, this woman, I'm not part of the selfie generation and the Instagram generation, and probably even if I was 20 years old now, I wouldn't do it. It's not my personality. But that's the type of person that'd be worth taping to show people, okay, this is concentration. She started skiing way later than anybody else on the national team. She had done pretty much every sport known to man beforehand. So she was a latecomer, and despite that, she was Olympic medalist. So for me, the attitude and the inspiration the athlete provides is more important than the celebrity status.
You mentioned mindfulness, and I have to admit, I haven't really engaged enough, and I haven't really tried enough. But meditation, look, it's the love discipline thing. I've just not given it the love. But I do get to those moments of now, that mindfulness through my yoga practice. And I do a very difficult vinyasa practice, sweat my rear end off, a lot of body weight stuff, some handstands and things like that. Talk about, from your experience, observing or being around, what is your view about yoga?
Actually, yoga is very good. Again, if I could replicate my life, I would probably have done yoga much younger. I've done some intensively for about 4 months, 3 years ago. It's one of these things, if there was a 26-hour day, I would do yoga. I think that it's underestimated as a practice in the sports world. Because everything we do, those of us who are dopamine dominant, tends to be yang, like we're the fire, but the intensity of your flame is function of the oil reserve, which is a yin reserve. And as weight training is yang, yoga is yin, right? And there's a basic principle: the more oil you have in your lamp, the more the flame can burn. Yoga is the yin to the weight training. So I think that, let's say if the Richard Branson tomorrow says to me, I want England to dominate the world, and I give you 8 years, right? And unlimited funds. Well, I would probably search out the best yoga instructors, and they would be responsible for probably 25% of the total training load. Because the advantage of yoga is that it's not depleting, it's repleting. It's something that I think I'm the first one to be guilty, and I'll admit it, to not have done enough with my athletes early on. I think it's a great practice, but it's like anything else. There's good lawyers or bad lawyers, there's good customs officers, bad customs officers. It's one of these cases where I would seek the best and then include it in my regimen.
I'm not about to brag about athletic prowess with you on the phone, given your experience and all of your clients, but I have to say I'm quite proud at the age of 47 as a 6 foot, 190-pound male that I can do the full splits. I know that's something that's very difficult for guys to do. And the only reason I can do that is because I tore my hamstring at age 15 playing baseball. And I just started stretching my hamstrings all the time. And it was kind of almost like your incident of the traumatic incident turning you into sports. My flexibility is a direct result of an injury.
Yes. I mean, the thing is that everybody gets an epiphany about why they start something, right? And then usually, the more severe the trauma, the more you will change. But to do the full splits at 47, that's pretty impressive for the listeners out there, because it does require quite a bit of commitment. Also, at your height, because typically flexibility is inversely proportionate to height. So that's why gymnasts are all short, Well, kudos to you, because it would take me, if I start today to make that my goal.
It's not a fun goal. It hurts.
Yeah, but anything worth achieving requires effort. Otherwise it's not worth achieving. It's like to make selection for Navy SEALs really hard to do. That's why there's not a lot of Navy SEALs. But that's why those guys are the guys we rely on when we need special operations. So anything that's high status does require commitment. I mean, there's nothing effortless that's worth it.
You mentioned the Navy SEALs. I had a buddy in San Diego who was a SEAL, and he didn't live on Coronado Island, and he hung out downtown. And the interesting thing about him is he would just wear T-shirts and jeans, and he was probably 5'8", but probably over 200 pounds. But the way he carried himself, I don't know if a lot of kind of people would recognize it, but I recognized it. The quiet confidence that and I think the last I chatted with him, he was trying to get into SEAL Team 6, but the quiet confidence that man carried, just something very unique to see up close and personal.
Yeah, if he's the alpha lion, he doesn't have to prove it himself. So, I mean, if you could kill people with your bare hands, you don't have to show it off. It's the guys with low. Actually, if you look at research, it is the men with the lowest testosterone who are the most violent.
Isn't that interesting, right?
Yeah, because, for example, Iran and Iraq have the lowest testosterone we know around the world. And then truth is truth. But the average onset of puberty in Iran and Iraq is age 17 for a male, which is really late. And the main reason is because the soil does not have any zinc. And you need zinc. The nickname for zinc is the great organizer. So zinc is what's responsible for testosterone production, HCl production, and so on. If you have low zinc, you have low testosterone. If you have, on top of that, a low meat intake, well, it's going to be hard to have a lot of testosterone, and that makes a lot of violent behavior. But I'll be politically incorrect both ways. Look at those soccer hooligans in the UK or in Scotland or Ireland. When they were at their top, if you look and measure their testosterone levels, they were abysmal. Okay. For example, DHEA sulfate values in the UK are between 1.6 and 1.8. So I had one of my students say, "Hey, I'm very male. Mine is 1.9." I said, "Actually, you don't qualify as a female in Canada, because in Canada, DHEA sulfate norm starts at 3 and ends at 10. So you're not even classified as a Catholic schoolgirl in Canada. So leave me alone with your high testosterone." So, high testosterone actually decreases aggressiveness because you can kill all the other animals. So you don't need to prove your point. It's the guys with low testosterone, like the soccer hooligans, that do a rampage all over the place.
If you look at the world through that lens, which is a physiological way of looking at the world, instead of saying, sociology or politics or something like that, if you look at it from the physics, the physiology, it really gives people a window. I mean, for example, and I'm not being politically incorrect. Everyone knows this is true. There is a high level of sexual violence towards women in India. I don't know the physiology issues going on with young Indian males.
They also have very low testosterone because a lot of them are vegetarians. Yeah, that's been quite demonstrated. Vegetarians, vegans have low testosterone.
You know what's funny too, talking to you, is because I think sometimes as we get older too, the notion of testosterone and the notion of being a male and being, I don't want to use the word tough, but I think to some degree there's a certain push in society to bring maleness down. Whereas, the whole idea that you could just make a vegan joke, you're not making it personal, you're not doing this, but you're just thinking big picture, all that you know about the body, and you're saying to yourself, well, it doesn't surprise me.
Yes. I mean, when I teach lectures, I always tell people, if you look at average blood values, what you have to picture is Homer Simpson, right? So being average, you're Homer Simpson. You're not Conan the Barbarian. Our physiology dictates our behavior. So men with low testosterone, because they have low zinc and they eat a vegan diet, will be violent towards women. Give them a steak, some HCl tablets and some zinc tablets, and they'll start behaving. It's a drama that people don't associate physiology with behavior. I mean, if you're a lion, you're built a certain way, you're going to, if you take a lion and you give it the diet of what you give the fish in your fish bowl, he's not going to behave so well. And the same thing, if I throw a ribeye in the aquarium, the fish is not going to rush for it, right? So we have to eat according to our genes. There's been a huge castration effect of the male in the media. I mean, you look at heroes in sitcoms, they're all fat and stupid. Right?
It's true. It's true. Or emasculated, And then a guy like you is positioned as a caveman who's useless to society, and hopefully you'll go away soon.
Yes. But, the thing is that, for example, in the Western world, the men with the lowest levels of testosterone, I'm talking about Europe, are Danes, right? So if I'm going to be politically correct, I may as well name as many nations as I can. But conversely, Danish women have the highest levels of testosterone in the Western world. But where did feminism start? Copenhagen, okay? Men have been punished for being men, and the women have been glorified to take on men's position. I don't have a problem with gender equality, but I'm against castration. So, and the male's a male. I mean, I think that if we actually looked at biology and foster what we're designed for, I mean, you don't have to be sexist about it, but meaning that we have that type of plumbing for a reason, and she has that type of plumbing for a reason. And there's things, for example, I'll never be able to get pregnant, but that's an expression that irritates me. We are pregnant. No, you're not. Okay, because you're not carrying the baby. You're not staying up at night. It's not kicking inside your stomach. I find it's one of the dumbest expressions one can use. We are pregnant. No, she is pregnant. She's doing all the work. You did 8 seconds of work, maybe, and that's it.
Just 8 seconds. Speak for yourself.
Yeah. You are pregnant?
Hey, just completely unrelated to this part of the conversation, but one of the things that I've gotten really intrigued at inside yoga, and my sport growing up was baseball, and I was a baseball catcher from age of like 10 to 21. I think that the squatting motion helped me with heavy squats. It's given me a very, for lack of a big term, big thighs, big hamstrings, big ass. The thing that I notice in Asia, which is really fascinating, is the Asian squat. I can't get as deep as most, for example, many Asian women can get, but I can get a few centimeters away, more so than most white guys probably could. What that does to my hips and the feeling and the flexibility and the ability to move, it's a fascinating, simple, even the weights, it's a fascinating, simple flexibility, strength exercise.
Yes, but also it's a osteoarthritis preventer. There's a very good Australian study where they measured knee and hip degeneration. okay, at the cartilage level, ligament level, but also at the bone level. And what they found is that age-matched Indians who are born in India and live in India have far less hip and knee degenerations than Indians born in Australia, which age match, because as soon as they adopt Australian culture, they don't full squat anymore. So full squatting is actually one of the best ways to prevent degeneration of the lower extremity and the spine. There's a very good set of data from the Swedish Olympic Committee that shows that the further your knees can travel over your toes, the least likely you're going to get injured in all types of sports injury, whether it's meniscus tears, hamstring tears, groin tears, and so on. And that study was further supported by a study on 40,000 Swiss soccer players. The deeper a kid could go in the squat, the least likely he's going to get injured playing soccer.
Hey, Charles, I didn't define the Asian squat. Why don't you define the Asian squat?
Basically, you squat so low that you can leave a stain on the carpet. That would probably be...
You're really trying to put your butt on the back of your ankles almost.
Correct. I mean, we call that ass to the grass squat. So the distance between your bum and the ground should be minimal. I mean, I'm exaggerating obviously when I say leave a stain on the carpet, but I find that dopamine increase in visuals always improve people's memory.
The testosterone violence connection that you're making, I'm sure if I went and did some homework, I would find that you're not the only person saying that. But when you talk about it like that, do you face criticism? Do people come at you and say, no way, forget it, that's not accurate?
No, because on my website, I've actually always put the references with it so people don't. But, it's something that if you go to PubMed and put levels of testosterone and violence, you will find thousands of studies on that. You could also find connections between zinc, vegetarianism, and violence. Because your best source of zinc, as far as like biologically absorbable, are things like oysters or red meat. So if you're a vegan, that's never part of your diet. But just look at throughout world history, who's been at war the longest, and you'll see it's the countries like. I mean, I'm not making this up. How long has Iran been in conflict with Iraq? Thousands. Forever. Right? And they've been low testosterone forever. How many times have you heard that Brazil's at war with somebody? Never. Why? Because the Brazilians, they have the highest testosterone levels, right? So when you have a population that has high testosterone, they tend to be quite peaceful.
We started this podcast talking about Ed Sekoto briefly. You've mentioned mindfulness in this episode. I want to read something to you very briefly and let you comment. I think you'll know the author. If you don't, I will remind you. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water. If you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. I think for me, that Bruce Lee line is just the most fabulous expression of Eastern philosophy kind of reduced to one little simple paragraph.
I mean, Bruce Lee has shaped a lot of my thinking, by the way. Because one of the things he said a long time ago is, use what is useful, reject what is not. So when he created Jeet Kune Do, he took the best of every martial art and blended it all. There's some stuff from some martial arts that he thought were stupid, and he left them out. And when people ask me, who influenced my strength training philosophy the most, I actually say Bruce Lee, because it was the mindset of, Bruce Lee said, there's a difference between martial arts for movies and martial arts for fighting in real life. He said it makes as much sense to kick someone in the face than to punch him in the toe. In other words, it looks great in the movie, but if somebody knows how to fight, when you kick him to the face, it gives a lot of warning, right? So a punch to the face is more effective than a kick to the face. You kick the guy in the face while he's already been knocked out. So on the way down, you reinforce your position of dominance. That quote by Bruce Lee is very true. Often when people ask me, who was one of the most influential people in your career, it is Bruce Lee.
There's a great clip of him. It's a casting call video clip. I think he's like 24, 25 years of age, somewhere in Hollywood or something. And he's got a suit on, and you can see the magnetic personality. And they're asking him some questions in this casting call. And they say, well, can you give us a little demonstration? He's got a suit on. They give us a little demonstration of some of your kicks or punches or something. And so they bring some older white guy out to stand there. And to watch the speed at which he throws a punch to not hit this man in the face. And the guy's kind of scared because he's kind of got, and the great confidence thing about Bruce Lee at that moment, he's like, no, don't worry, I won't touch you. And he is throwing that punch so hard and so fast, anybody would probably have fear. And he's just like, don't worry, I won't touch you.
You love what he did. No need for discipline. Put the hours in. Actually, he was in the sporting world, he was actually one of the earliest proponents of strength training. Actually, my karate sensei lifted weights because Bruce Lee did. He says, if that guy is that fast and he lifts weight, therefore weight training must make him fast. And Bruce Lee said really early, he dispelled the myth of being muscle bound. He said, you want to get fast, you got to lift some weights.
Yeah, his body's, look, I'm not saying it is a weird thing, but his body is amazing. And to see his body strength when he does some of those push-ups on one or two fingers or something, obviously the man was in insane strength.
Oh, yes, that's for sure.
Yeah. Hey, Charles, I've kept you for too long. I would love to chat again in the future. I think we could go on for hours. StrengthSensei.com. You are traveling the world. I would love to know some of the physical clues to jet lag that you figured out, some of the physical tricks and tips. But where will you be next? You've got this. Is it a world tour right now? You're just a man on the road? What's going on?
Right now, I'm leaving Sydney tomorrow. I'll be teaching in Montreal. Then I'll be teaching in England, possibly Malaysia. So I've got quite a bit of a tour, but all my events are on StrengthSensei.com. If you look at the world tour, and then there's a map of the world, so we made it really idiot-proof. You just click on the country that interests you, or we could go by the events. But, that's a thing we could talk about on the next podcast, is how to fight jet lag. I've traveled so much in my life that there's no way I would have done what I've done if I didn't know how to manage jet lags perfectly. And there's ways to nutrition timing where the key, Michael, is to behave like the locals when you land. And there's a series of tricks to do that. And if you want me to share that with you on a future podcast, I would gladly do it.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I'll have to take a look at your schedule and connect with your assistant too. Maybe the next time you're in Asia, I can come to get in your location or something. So
that would be great.
Yeah. Hey, great conversation. Like I said, I know by the way the experiences you have, the people that you've trained with, the people that you have trained. I know people are going to really love this podcast because they can just pull insights from here and there. So a world of experience. Thank you, Charles, for your time.
Thank you, Michael.
And finally, my last guest of this particular mega episode, Steven Pinker.
I think one of the most fascinating things that I've read about your career, and there's a lot of things that I want to talk about today in a short amount of time. Your career is very diverse. But I found it fascinating to see that you knew that you were an atheist at the age of 13. Talk to that. How did you come to that revelation as such a young man?
I don't think it was an explicit conversion or deconversion. I just didn't devote a whole lot of thought to it. I think if you had probed me, that's what I have said, but it just wasn't really part of my consciousness because God was never part of my consciousness. It was really only in the 90s when atheism became an issue on the world stage, and people started asking me that it even occurred to me to think about it one way or another.
And I think this will go into our conversation throughout today, which is you are attempting to the best of your ability to put science as the decider of what is. And speak to that. Speak to the conversion as a young man to where you knew that to the best of your abilities, science was going to guide you.
Well, I take an expansive view of science. I don't think there's any single procedure called the scientific method. I think that science just is the attempt to explain phenomena using explanations that you can show to the best of your ability are true. So, and that's why science in practice involves a huge diversity of methods, from experiments to observations to math models to computer simulations. Science, in my view, is the attempt to derive true explanations for the world around us. This grew gradually. I think it helps that my chosen field is experimental psychology. It's not traditionally one of the sciences. It is constantly in an attempt to become more scientific. It covers phenomena from visual perception to war and peace to writing style that traditionally have not been approached scientifically, but increasingly have been.
One of the topics that I want to jump into with you today is one of your books, The Blank Slate. And I think it's going to be a fascinating perspective for people that have not thought about this, is the notion that human behavior, it's been shaped by evolution. I mean, what's the inner workings of our mind? It just didn't unfold blank slate. That's your perspective. Talk about how that began for you, that process of learning and getting into the research and to the data.
The blank slate is a metaphor for the mind as empty at birth, completely blank, where all of the structure of the mind comes from society, parents, and culture. That is, of course, the position that my book, The Blank Slate, argues against. I came to it from an interest in learning, in particular, how children acquire their first language. The immediate realization is learning is not possible unless you have some kind of innate circuitry that does the learning. Our cats don't learn language. A laptop doesn't learn language, but a baby does. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that any particular language can be innate. We're obviously not born speaking English or Japanese or Yiddish or any other language. But the ability to analyze speech coming out of your parents' mouths and derive the various grammatical rules that allow us to produce and comprehend an infinite number of sentences for the rest of our lives, that learning ability depends on the child being shaped in particular ways. This is an idea that's also associated with my former colleague at MIT, Noam Chomsky, who way back in the 1950s proposed that children are born with an innate ability to learn language. And it just, for me, was just the necessity that you can't have learning unless there is some kind of built-in machinery to do the learning. Now that, I think, applies not just to learning language, but to learning the other things that we encounter through our lives, other people, making sense of their behavior, objects, making sense of the three-dimensional world around us. I then was naturally led to the question, if the mind has some built-in structure, where did it come from? Well, it had to have come from the same source that the structure of the body came from, namely the processes of evolution, most notably Darwin's process of natural selection. And that led me, in my book called How the Mind Works, to try to fulfill the promise of that audacious title with a combination of cognitive science, that is the idea that the mind is an information processing system, and evolutionary psychology, the idea that the structure of our mind comes from natural selection, and therefore the innate complex properties of the mind ultimately can be explained as adaptations, that is, as systems that allowed our ancestors to survive and produce.
These views have not been without controversy. Many people, and you write about these, there's certain fears that come with these realizations that you've put in print in your work. People are afraid of the idea that it might not be a blank slate.
Indeed. And after publishing How the Mind Works, which was really on a book of psychology, of just explaining how we see, how we experience emotions, how we make sense of the world, how we form relationships, I became so aware of the political and moral and emotional colorings of the concept of human nature that I felt that I needed a book to explore those. And that's how The Blank Slate came into existence. The Blank Slate, by the way, is just about to be republished with an afterword, about a dozen years after it first came out. And it was a book that asked, why should the idea that the mind has any organization be so emotionally fraught, so controversial? Because we all know from just living our lives as ordinary human beings and applying our common sense that the mind isn't a blank slate. Anyone who's had more than one child will tell you that you really can't shape your children like putty. They have their own personalities as soon as they emerge from the womb. Anyone who's been in a heterosexual relationship knows that men and women are not indistinguishable. There are really some differences between them. So why does our common sense so often clash with our political convictions? And I explored several reasons. One of them is that many people think that the ideal of equality, the idea that you should not discriminate on the basis of gender or race or ethnicity, requires that all people be indistinguishable, that we're all clones. And that the terror is, if men and women differ in any way, would that open the door to sexism and discrimination? And I argue in that book that that's an error, that fairness is not the same as sameness. You can adhere to a principle that a person must not be discriminated against on the basis of their race or gender or ethnicity, simply on grounds of equity. And that is not the same as insisting, quite apart from any evidence, that all groups of people are absolutely identical. A second fear is a fear of kind of a fatalism. That is, if we were blank slates, that holds out the hope that a new generation with proper child-rearing techniques and proper schools could wipe out all the traits that we don't like in ourselves. We could bring up a generation of children who are generous and committed to society and peaceful and open-minded. And the fear is, if instead the human mind is equipped with certain inborn traits that helped our survival, our ancestors survive and reproduce, wouldn't that say that human nature is so messed up that it's hopeless to try for social improvement? We're kind of stuck with the world that we have, and it justifies a kind of reactionary fatalism. Now, I argue in the blank slate that too is a non sequitur, because the mind is a complex system. We have many emotions and motives that are constantly battling themselves out inside our skulls. And even if we have some nasty traits, if there's a little voice inside us that seeks revenge, or that favors our own ethnic group over others, or that is selfish or short-sighted, there are other parts of the mind that can assimilate social norms, that can reason, that can express empathy, that can exercise a sense of fairness. And how people actually behave depends on which aspect of human nature gets the upper hand. And that can be affected by institutions, prevailing social norms. And so the human nature gives you the material that we want to work with in creating a better society. It doesn't condemn us to a world of perpetual strife and selfishness. And in fact, I, of all people, may have done more to cash out that idea than anyone else in recent memory, because in 2011, I wrote a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature that showed that not just is it theoretically possible for people to indulge in less violence, that's exactly what's happened. And I assembled a lot of data sets showing that rates of violence have come down over the course of history, well within the ambit of human nature. It's just that certain parts of human nature, like reason and empathy and self-control, got the upper hand over other parts of human nature, like dominance, revenge, aggression, and so on.
You are right. As you mentioned some of your books, I have 5 pages of notes in front of me. So you're quite prolific. And I mean, it's got to be quite fun to have built the career that you have built and just get to explore your curiosity on a daily basis. That's just fun. Whatever one's curiosity is, if you have the passion for it and you can chase it, you clearly do. It's a lot of fun, huh?
It sure is. I mean, it has its moments of stress and anxiety and frustration, like any career. But I do consider myself privileged to be a professor, have the freedom to explore ideas, write about them, teach students, engage in debate and argument. So yes, it's a great life.
Let me get back to the blank slate notion for a moment. So here's a big question that people surely have when they start to hear some of your views and some of your research. Are we born good or bad?
With some of each. I mean, we have, the mind is complicated. There are lots of parts. You look at the brain, you see it's this massively complex, convoluted structure built on layers. We have systems that we inherited from our primate and our mammalian and our reptilian ancestors. We've got this massively overgrown cerebral cortex that allows us to think and reason and control our emotions. And so there's no yes or no answer to whether we are born good. We have elements in us that can allow us to behave in morally defensible ways. We also have a lot of nasty and ugly motives.
And I want to shift into language a little, and I want to just give a really brief story. That's something that happened to me. I'm currently in Vietnam. I was at a girlfriend's hometown over the weekend. We were at after lunch, but she's bilingual, but her friends really didn't speak much English. They knew a few words. This is post right around Tet. Some of the crazy shots come out, the alcohol shots, and a few of these shots get into me, and the next thing I know, I'm swearing a little. An F-bomb comes out. And one of her friends that really didn't understand English too well, but understood that, got very offended. As you can see, and as you know much more so than I, language becomes a very interesting thing when you start mixing cultures and language and swearing, and it just opens a Pandora's box of analysis, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I'm interested in the way that language is connected to emotion. In my book, The Stuff of Thought, I have a chapter on swearing called The 7 Words You Can't Say on Television, an homage to George Carlin. But it analyzes the phenomenon that linguists call them taboo words, because there are a lot of words that psychologically are just like swear words, but we don't think of them as swearing. Like the word that we can't even say on a radio or a podcast that we call the N-word. Now, that is by far the most inflammatory taboo word. We don't call it swearing, but psychologically it's the same thing. Namely, the mere act of uttering it has the power to shock. And there's reason to think that taboo language involves different parts of the brain, that people who have suffered a stroke to the language circuitry of the left hemisphere and lose the ability to speak fluently can often retain their ability to swear. Swearing may be bilateral, that is, it may involve the right hemisphere as well as the left hemisphere, and it seems to involve some ancient circuits buried deep in the limbic system, the reptilian brain, that are probably connected to the reflex that we have to shout if someone steps on our toe or if we slice our finger together with a bagel, the so-called rage circuit that makes an organism erupt in a loud noise if it is suddenly frustrated or victimized. That's one kind of swearing anyway. It's when we shout out an expletive when we stub our toe. But there are other kinds of swearing, all of which, though, involve some connection between words in the language system and the emotional circuitry of the brain.
Stephen, go back in time a little bit. The development of language, the evolution of language. I think many out there, perhaps people on a different side of the argument to you, have said that at a certain point in time back in history, language just kind of spontaneously happened. But I think you see it differently. Explain your view and explain what you've learned throughout your career about the evolution of language.
Well, language is a complicated system. It's complicated not just computationally, that is, that there are lots of things going on in the brain when we put together a sentence or understand a sentence. There's the complicated gymnastics that we exercise with our mouth and tongue and throat. There's the complex analysis of the sound wave that we engage in when we understand language. We've got to look up words in a fraction of a second, and we have vocabularies on the order of 50 to 100,000 words. Each of which is completely arbitrary, an arbitrary pairing between a sound and a meaning. Then we have all those grammatical rules that allow us to know who did what to whom by unraveling the order of words and the way they're packed into phrases. We figure out whether it was the man that bit the dog or the dog that bit the man. We also know that language is complex genetically. There isn't a single gene where if it's mutated, you have a child who's just mute. There are probably a large number of genes, each of which improves our linguistic communication by an eensy-weensy bit. Now, that suggests that language could not have appeared in one fell swoop, that there just was a caveman who was mute, who had a daughter or a son who burst forth into full speech. It suggests that there was some, the evolution of every other complex organ, there was a set of intermediate stages, each one of which could have been the result of some mutation or combination. And thanks to the advantages that it granted in terms of better memory, better communication, it was selected. And then over hundreds or thousands of generations, our ancestors became more articulate.
I think sometimes we like to think of evolution when we go to, let's say, the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C., and you see this would be back when I was a kid, you'd see the development of man. It's kind of this linear progression. But mutation is underrated. People don't think about mutation as much as we perhaps should. I mean, a good deal of evolution is all about mutation and an unexpected, random, happen chance. And next thing you know, the branch of life goes in an entirely different direction.
Well, mutations are dripping into the gene pool all the time. Each one of us probably introduces 60 mutations into our eggs and sperm, and then more mutations happen as our brains and bodies develop, although those are not ones that we pass on to our kids. And mutations provide the raw material for selection. That's why there are differences among organisms, some of which run a little faster, see a little better, think a little more clearly, speak a little more clearly, digest a little more efficiently than others. And that's what natural selection operates on. It's extraordinarily unlikely that a mutation will give you right off the bat anything useful. Just because you make any random tweak to a system or random large modification, it's almost inevitably going to be worse rather than better. Big changes are much more likely to disable a system than to give it a huge boost in functionality. Small mutations, though, are at least have some chance at making you a little bit faster, allow you to see a little bit more clearly, and those are the ones that get selected. But just by the laws of probability, it's extraordinarily unlikely that you have a macro mutation, what used to be called a hopeful monster, that is some radically different freak that just happens to be to function better than its parents.
You've been influenced by a lot of different people, but two of your peers that I think you're very fond of, I would love for you to tell the audience, perhaps, and the audience can go learn more about them. Two people I'm thinking of off the top of my head are Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett, who I'm fond of their thinking and their manner as well. But speak to both of those men for a moment, perhaps even just a sentence or two, what you've learned from those two guys in terms of, as we're talking evolution and Darwin and whatnot, how Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett inspired or influenced you.
Dan Dennett, before he achieved fame as an exponent of evolution in Darwin's dangerous idea, and before he became one of the four famous atheists with breaking the spell, was a prolific writer on the philosophy of cognitive science and artificial intelligence, the philosophical implications. He was both an explainer of the idea that the mind can be understood as an information processing system, and he explored its implications for classic issues in philosophy like epistemology, innate ideas, and imagery. And so I have read Dan Dennett since I was a graduate student. He's also a model of clear, witty writing. Unlike so many academics whose writing is stodgy and turgid and pretentious, he always wrote in an accessible style. From the time I was a graduate student, that gave me the idea that you can explore deep and serious ideas, but you can be clear and unpretentious at the same time. I came across Dawkins later. I was already a professor. His books, The Blind Watchmaker and The Selfish Gene, were true revelations because that was my first entree into evolutionary biology. I learned most of what I had known from the writings of Stephen Jay Gould, also a gifted writer, but one with an idiosyncratic and somewhat eccentric view of evolution. Gould always insisted that he was revolutionizing Darwin's theory. I don't think he succeeded, but it offered what I now think to be a rather distorted and idiosyncratic view. Dawkins presented the mainstream consensus of evolutionary biology, also in lucid and witty prose, really explained the mechanism of both just how natural selection works, and in particular in Selfish Gene, how social relations among organisms evolve, why we're nice to some of our fellows, why we're not so nice, why we have mixed feelings, all in both a clear and rigorous way. And that was my invitation to explore the literature in evolutionary biology more deeply.
Steve, I caught a tweet that you put out. It was linking to a story about gills, our latent gills that never developed. I think about stories like that, and they're fascinating to me. They're just truly fascinating. You're talking to a guy that has a scale T-Rex skull and a scale Triceratops skull in his house. But these areas are very controversial. And before I came to Asia, I was living in San Diego. There's actually a museum in San Diego that has a dinosaur and man in the same setting to prove a certain belief, to even if there's no evidence for this, to prove a certain belief. And so I thought it was really interesting that link that you linked off to about the gills. It's one thing for somebody to say, you know what, I just don't want to believe this. But I was really shocked at the amount of effort that people will go to in a way to try and dispute it and come up with this really intricate rationales as to why what we are seeing is not really there.
Yes, well, the United States is an unusual advanced industrialized democracy, that we're the only country where there is a real significant proportion of people who doubt what scientists have shown long ago, namely that we all evolved by the process of natural selection. And so you have a vocal creationist segment in the United States, as you do in many Islamic countries, under the influence of religious dogma. The Bible says that we were created by God, and therefore that's what people think they have to believe, in the face of massive evidence that we evolved from simpler organisms. And the link that I tweeted on the latest in the story of embryonic gill arches comes from one of Darwin's 5 kinds of evidence for evolution. Way back in the 1850s, he noted that the embryos of many animals show vestigial traces of organs that are not particularly useful to that organism, but happen to be fully functioning in the organism's ancestors. The fact that our babies have a coat of hair, lanugo, which then disappears because our ancestors were furry. At some point in evolution, we lost our fur, but we lost it by getting rid of it in utero. The program for building a baby was the generic mammalian program that equipped it with a coat of fur. Then the fur falls off in humans. Likewise, way back in the 19th century, it was noted that all vertebrates, including humans, go through a stage as embryos in which we have arches in our neck that in fish turn into gills in the case of, and that's how they originated, but in other organisms develop into parts of the ear, parts of the jaw. That then became a kind of creationist counter-argument saying, well, human babies never had gills, that evolutionists who point to the gill arches in the development of humans are trying to mislead kids because those aren't gills. And it's true, they're not gills, but of course no one ever said they were gills. They are parts of anatomy. They're a series of arches that in fish turn into gills, in other vertebrates like reptiles and mammals turn into parts of jaws and ears. But the evolutionary continuity is unmistakable. And the article that I tweeted just went through that entire controversy from the 19th century to the present, including the consensus of biologists today that we really did have gill arches and they are related to the gills of fish.
Yeah, it was fascinating. It's fascinating. Hey, with our time we have left, I want to go into Better Angels, and I want to talk about violence, because you can't help but flip on any cable news show, pick up a newspaper, and the lead every night is a horrific act of violence. It's nonstop. And it seems like ever since 9/11, the powers that be, the media powers that be, have kept us on the edge of our seats waiting for doom and gloom. Why don't you talk about the history of violence, where violence has come from, where we are today? Because I think most people would probably think intuitively by the information they receive that we are in the most violent time of human history, but it's not exactly true, is it?
No, that's right. And you can't get an accurate picture of the amount of violence in the world from reading the news, because the news finds the violent events wherever they occur and publicizes them. So all the news can tell you is that the rate of violence is not zero, and of course it isn't zero. But since you never see a guy with a microphone and a sound truck in front of a school saying, "Here I am in front of Middletown High School where there hasn't been a shooting today," or "Here I am reporting from a country in Africa that's not at war," you have no idea how many parts of the world are peaceful just by being told about the ones that are not. So the only way you really can tell what the trends for violence are is to count the number of violent episodes as a proportion of the number of opportunities for violence. How many people are there? How many countries are there? Plot it over time and see how it's changed. And when you do, you find something astonishing, that virtually every measure of violence has come down over the course of history. The rate of homicide in countries for which we have data going back centuries has plummeted. An Englishman had a 35 times greater chance of being murdered in the Middle Ages compared to now. Even in the United States, where, again, the United States is an unusual country, we have a higher murder rate than most democracies, but our homicide rate has fallen by more than half in the last couple of decades. Our ancestors used to have hundreds of capital crimes on the law books. People could be executed for shoplifting or for criticizing the king. Now, the only capital crime is murder, and even that has been abolished in most Western countries. In fact, more and more countries all over the world. And even war, you might think that given what's happening in Syria and Nigeria and Afghanistan, that the world has seen an increase in wars, but not if you count. There are wars now. There were far more of them in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. You are speaking from Vietnam, which of course was the source of the bloodiest war since the Second World War. Between 2 and 3 million people killed, depending on how you count. Vietnam fought a war after that with China, but for several decades it has been at peace. And that's something you don't hear about in the news. You don't see the reporter saying, "Here I am in Hanoi and bombs aren't falling."
And no violence, Steve. I've not seen any violence in 3 years.
Well, the rate is relatively low, and significantly Southeast Asia, which used to be one of the bloodiest places on earth, has not seen a war in many, many years. That's the kind of fact that you forget about when you only concentrate on the parts of the world that do have wars.
Yeah. You also bring up, as people like to think about 20th century bad guys, the Stalin, the Hitler, the Mao, the Pol Pot. But you point out 13th century Mongols and 40 million people killed, but with the population of the world was far, far smaller. So, I mean, even though the 20th century looked just bloody awful, the 13th century was even bloodier awful.
Yeah, there were definitely some monsters throughout history, and some episodes of massive bloodletting. I mean, there's no mistaking the fact that the 1940s were a period where both genocide and war deaths hit horrific peaks. So it's not that the decline of violence has been a steady descent from hundreds of years ago, lower, 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 lower. There are undoubtedly ups and downs, and the two world wars in the 20th century were big ups, but they were not unique. There were wars that killed a greater percentage of the world's population, as you note, the European wars of religion, the fall of the Ming Dynasty, the conquests of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. But since the end of World War II, in the 70 years that have elapsed since then, there's been actually a historically unprecedented decline in interstate wars. The old-fashioned wars that had one country pitted against another, those have gone way down. The last really big one was Iran versus Iraq. But the trajectory has been a downward roller coaster. There's some ups and downs, but overall downward. Civil wars have still occurred. Those have not disappeared the way wars against countries have. But civil wars are still less plentiful than they used to be, and the death rate is way down from the peaks during the 70s and 80s.
You cite Tom Schelling, you bring him in, and I've actually had Robert Allman on my podcast. They share the Nobel Prize together. And I think the notion of cooperative games is an interesting way to look at one of the reasons that violence has dropped. Because often in this day and age, and as you talk about, why there's less and less one state, hey, we're state A and state B, we're going to go head to head. But often in this day and age, as we've learned, as we've evolved, we're better off to each other alive than dead, which I think goes back to Schelling and Aumann's work.
Indeed. The Schelling and Aumann's work is highly technical, and most people can't follow the math. On the other hand, people do have concepts like a win-win situation or a zero-sum game, which trickle down from game theory and which can affect the way you think of a conflict. That is, do you think of a conflict as, is he going to win or am I going to win? Or you can think of a conflict as, how do he and I both gracefully step out of this conflict? Those are two different ways of looking at war. And a kind of game theoretic mindset says just trying to defeat the other guy could leave me much worse off than if I'm clever enough to figure out a way to get out of this contest in the first place. And I think we have increasingly seen that. We've seen the use of economic sanctions instead of bombing, most recently in the case of Iran's nuclear program. We've seen UN peacekeepers. We've seen international organizations that try to settle disputes by negotiation rather than warfare. I mean, it used to be that war was just a part of the policy options of any country dealing with any other country. What do we do about the fact that such and such a country has been stingy in their terms of trade or are not buying our product? Well, what do you think? Should we invade them? Should we wage war on them? And that's the way countries used to operate. Now that has become, in most of the world, almost unthinkable. If Canada and Spain have a dispute over flatfish, you don't have the Canadian Parliament saying, well, do you think we should declare war on Spain? It's just kind of off the table. And that change in mindset is responsible for the fact that wars are, especially big wars, are less frequent than they used to be.
We all need to ponder what it would be like if we did not have our current nation states today. As you quote Hobbes is saying, it would be nasty, brutish, and short. The state, and I get frustrated with the state, I get frustrated with politics, I get frustrated with the craziness every now and again, but the state really does. It's played a huge role in the drop in violence, hasn't it?
Yes, for reasons that Thomas Hobbes pointed out, namely, and in fact, based on a kind of game theoretic mode of thinking, which, by the way, Schelling himself adapted. It's sometimes called the Hobbesian trap, namely, even if you didn't have a violent bone in your body, if you were worried that maybe your neighbor might invade to steal your stuff and maybe kill you in the process, you might be tempted to try to wipe out your neighbor in a preemptive strike, not because you don't like him, but because you're worried that if you don't do it to him, he'll do it to you. Now, he could be running through the exact same calculation. He may not harbor any malevolent motives to you, but legitimately fear that you might wipe him out, perhaps if for no other reason that you're worried that he might wipe you out ad infinitum. When you have a third party, a state that will penalize the first act of aggression, it can calm everyone down, because not only are you deterred by the state from stealing from your neighbor or killing your neighbor, but you know that your neighbor is deterred from stealing from or killing you. And that can damp down the tensions that can erupt in warfare, even when there isn't a thirst for blood. Now, of course, that raises the problem that states themselves can and do and have inflicted violence on their citizens. And I think of humanity as poised between the hazards of anarchy and the hazards of tyranny. I see the quest for a workable democracy as an attempt to come up with a form of government that is strong enough to prevent people from preying on each other while not preying on the people itself. And that's what we want in a good democratic government.
On an individual level, this really comes down to putting yourself in the other person's shoes. And at certain points in time in history, and not too many decades ago, people would have, and even still in various places, for example, with ISIS, the idea of torture and really trying to hurt another human being and to really inflict awful pain. We've evolved to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And that's also played a huge role in the violence decreasing, hasn't it?
That's right. There's reason to think that our circle of empathy is expanded. We all are born with a sense of empathy, but we don't necessarily apply it to every living thing. It's very easy to apply your sense of empathy only to people who are in your immediate circle, your family, your tribe, your friends, cute little fuzzy animals. The idea that we ought to empathize with every human being, or for that matter, every living thing, is more recent, and it has to be encouraged. We look with incomprehension and horror at both our ancestors who would burn people alive, or break them on the wheel, or impale them with spikes as a routine form of criminal punishment. We look the same way at ISIS today, thinking like, what could they possibly be feeling? How could they not themselves feel a stab of pain, seeing the pain suffered by others? But it is a sad part of human psychology that empathy for every other living thing is not automatic. And one of the areas of progress has been to take the point of view of people who are unlike ourselves, and to put ourselves in their shoes and treat them the way we treat our immediate circle.
I hope they're not coming for you. I hear the sirens in the back.
No, I think I'm safe.
Hey, I have one last kind of fun question, but there's a lot of seriousness behind it. You know, the way that we're taught often is, you know, find the monogamous relationship and you know, one person for one person, and that often has benefits, and we've learned those benefits. But there are biological drives that push us to think more than one person. Talk about that some in the short period of time we have left.
Well, certainly, if you look at human behavior, you can't avoid the conclusion that we're not naturally perfectly monogamous. That men, in particular, harbor a desire for no-string sex more than women do. Women harbor desires for partners that might be complementary to or superior to the one that they're tied to. On the other hand, we also get jealous of our mates. We like the idea that each one of us might stray now and again. We don't particularly like the idea that our partner might stray, at least most of us. And so a lot of monogamy is, at the personal level, it is the trade-off between the freedom to play around and the assurance that your partner won't play around. It also, at a social level, one great advantage of monogamy is that you don't have competition over mates. If you have polygamy, in particular polygyny, which has been the practice of 80% of human societies, it's much more common than polyandry. That is, several women, one man is more common than several men, one woman. But when that happens, then you have one guy with several wives, which means that there are several guys with no wives. Now, since men like sex, that means that men will often compete, and often violently, and you often have tribal wars to abduct women. You've got duels fought over women. And when you have a monogamous social system, then that's the ultimate egalitarianism. It means that all men are equal in terms of the number of legal wives that they can have, at least, and it eliminates that source of competition.
Steve, you've got too many different angles in your life, too many directions you've gone. Where will you be going next?
Well, my next book will be take us back to the question that opened up our conversation. It's a defense of science, reason, and humanism as a source of meaning and morality.
Great. When will that be out?
2017.
Okay. Hopefully I can get you back on. We'll talk just about that. We'll have a very defined direction. But I appreciate you coming on. And listen, all your books, everyone should be able to find easily on Amazon. There is quite a bit of reading for people to get involved with. Steve, is there a best website to send people to check more about you?
StephenPinker.com.
Easy enough. Steve, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed all of those guests. You will also be able to find much of my content starting to unfold on YouTube. Easily found at youtube.com/trend following. I mean, did you expect it to be anything other than trend following? youtube.com/trend following. Once again, I appreciate your commitment to giving me your ears. Hopefully, time permitting, life permitting, I will be able to continue this podcast forever. Because let's face it, they're going to figure out life extension. And when they figure out life extension, I will line up first in line to have my mind ported to a hard drive. And of course, once we're ported to a hard drive, we live forever. You might say to yourself, how do we live forever on a hard drive? How the hell do you know we're not on a hard drive already? I'll let you chew on that one.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.